So I just like to welcome you all. And before we get started, I would also like to just thank all the supporters, all the people that made this conference happen, all the organizations that helped create this, all the donors that supplied the donations so we can get our free lunches, so we can reserve this wonderful auditorium. So I just really would like to thank the Hauenstein Center, the Hidden Wounds of War Planning Committee, the Military Michigan Combat PTSD Task Force, and Grand Valley State, of course, American Legion, the Michigan Wounded and Returning Warrior Program, Forest View Hospital, Riverview Psychological Services PC, Soul Repair, and of course the West Michigan Veteran Coalition. So I'm going to take a step back. My name's Alana Bridges. For those that don't know me, I do a lot in veteran services. I am the Veteran Services Community Coordinator for Region 4, 5, 9, and coordinator of what? To actually establish veteran community action teams throughout the state of Michigan. And that's one of the big pushes within the state of Michigan, is to set up coalitions to really be that one conduit of all our service providers to come together to better serve our veterans. The West Michigan Veteran Coalition is Prosperity Region 4 VCAT, and if you would like to be a part of the West Michigan Veteran Coalition, please go to our table and either drop off your card or write down your name and your information, or send me an email. And my email will be at the end of this presentation. So I think we're ready to get started. If I could have everyone stand for those that you can. And please join us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, for liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please take a seat. We have a very, very big day today, and we hope that you can stay with us for the whole day. We're going to be showing the HBO, We're going to be showing the HBO documentary War Torn, 1861 to 2010. We have a video panel discussion, a breakout. We're going to be breaking out in small groups. We've assigned everyone with a number. I'm going to have Dr. Ryan talk a little bit more about the breakouts during that time that we do this breakout. It could be a logistical nightmare, or it might not be. We're breaking out into 9 breakouts. So each classroom has a breakout. And essentially, it's just dialogue to talk about the documentary. At that point, we will be providing lunch, thanks to our donations. I'm going to have Dr. Ross. He's going to be speaking on PTSD and suicide in the military. Dr. Major, the unique ways current war injuries alter the brain. And Chaplain Colonel Herman Kaiser, the workshop that addresses the needs of veterans with moral injury. That's going to be a very interesting conversation. So before we get started, I actually would like to introduce Gleaves Whitney. Gleaves became the first full-time director of Grand Valley State University's Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies in 2003. During his tenure, he has been an architect for more than 400 public programs. He has created a web column, Ask Jeeves, which is the first presidential Q&A column in the nation. And he has created Leadership Academy for students and young professionals committed to public service. There's so much more I could definitely tell you about Gleaves Whitney, but I will let him come up here and introduce himself, as well as talk a little bit more about him, as well as why is it so important for the Hauenstein Center to support the Hidden Wounds of War Conference. So, here you go.
Good morning. So good to see you this morning. Thanks so much for your participation in this conference. This is the third time, it's the third rodeo we've had with the Hidden Wounds of War. It starts back in 2008 when Dr. Michael Ryan and I started having lunch and talking about the possibilities for this. And then as Elena alluded, last year we really started, I think, to gather momentum, and this year is the result of the hard work of a lot of people. We're so pleased to see so many different constituents in this very important challenge our society faces. Now, our gathering, as Elena indicated in the previous slide, our gathering wouldn't have been possible without the help of a lot of partners, and I also want to give a shout out to all of those partners who were so instrumental in pulling off, I think, a flawless morning and registration and getting everybody in here. The only thing you all didn't do is stop the rain. I hasten to add the appreciation we feel at the Hauenstein Center for Grand Rapids' greatest World War II veteran. Colonel Ralph W. Hauenstein is our hero at the Hauenstein Center. He just celebrated his 103rd birthday, and why don't we give Ralph a round of applause. I watched the HBO documentary War Torn last night for the first time. I had to get up at several points during the course of the viewing and pause the show. As you'll soon see, it begins with a question that the blind warrior poet Homer poses, I think, to veterans of every generation. Must you carry the bloody horror of combat in your heart forever? Well, during the course of my life, I've lived with two wounded warriors who had post-traumatic stress, and I suspect the answer to Homer's question is yes. The sacrifice that our warriors and their families must bear is really nothing short of heroic. Watching the documentary and absorbing the stories of struggling combat veterans and their families, I recalled a line by Melville in Moby Dick about the character who, emotionally at least, lived in an ice house constructed of frozen sighs. Let that image sink in. Lived in an ice house constructed of frozen sighs. I imagine Melville captures the emotional reality that many in this audience have experienced at some point. And speaking of struggle, I'd like to tell you something about Ralph Hauenstein that you perhaps do not know. He served directly under General Eisenhower during World War II. He was part of the intelligence branch of the U.S. Army, and he was instrumental in the planning of D-Day. And I once asked Ralph, in all of your international business travel, did you ever get back to the cemeteries of Normandy? Did you ever see these great monuments to our war heroes? And he looked at me, he was very grim. He said, no, I've never been back there. He said, I sent men on missions that amounted to a death sentence, and I did not want to see their names in the headstones. But I can tell you this, speaking for Ralph, he may not have gone back to the memorial gardens and the cemeteries, but those names are engraved in his heart, carved deeply in his heart. I asked him, how he has been able to cope with that. And it's been tough for him. I'm going to give you an example in just a minute. But he also, in February 1945, was the first American officer into Dachau. Now, Ralph wouldn't talk about that experience for many decades. In fact, he didn't begin to open up about his experience at Dachau until about 10 years ago. And it was horrifying for him. He was able to give voice to the unspeakable. The images in his mind, bodies stacked like cordwood, instruments of torture for the pleasure of the torturers, lampshades of human skin. I asked Ralph how he dealt with such disturbing images in his mind, how he'd carried them all these decades. He said, quote, I still can't sleep some nights. I have nightmares. In fact, the first 6 months after the war, I wasn't worth a damn. And so we ask with Homer, must you carry the bloody horror of combat in your heart forever? Now, I am the son of a combat veteran who fought in the Pacific Theater during World War II. Dad was a waist gunner on a B-24. He and his generation came back from the war and did much to build our country during the day. But then came the night. Sometimes at night, it seemed that Dad and his comrades could not escape the war. Now, Dad never talked much about his personal Iliad, but in our house, we knew he suffered from something that he had experienced in 1943 or 1944, and we just didn't know what to call it. Often he drank too much. Sometimes we kids would be awakened by the scream of his recurring nightmare. Occasionally he would go on a TV jag and watch westerns. Looking back, I guess Gunsmoke and Bonanza helped Dad process the war, because in every episode it was clear who the guys in the white hats were and who the guys in the black hats were. In every storyline, the men in the white hats sometimes had to dispatch the men in the black hats, but only out of moral necessity. Once, only once in our house, did Dad allude to the friends he had lost, the 10 men on the B-24 crew that shared a tent next to Dad's tent in the New Guinea jungle. One day they all went out on a bombing mission, and that crew was shot down and they never made it back. Well, it turns out that that crew had a parrot, and those boys had trained that parrot to repeat every one of their names. So Bobby, Johnny, Timmy, Robbie. Well, in the dark of that New Zealand jungle, when Dad's crew was lying in the tent after this bombing run, they heard that darn parrot, and that parrot repeated the names of those men. And the captain in Dad's tent took his gun out, went over to the next tent, and shot the parrot. Now, when my generation was young, we did not know what to call the hidden wounds of war. We did not understand the terrible odyssey that returning veterans experience, much less their Iliad during the war itself. But thankfully, that is beginning to change. Right here in Grand Rapids, I see a room full of people and many others who are doing wonderful work to help people recover their souls, their emotional life, their connections with family and friends. And it's my happy task to introduce one of the people doing that good work right now. Dr. Mark Kane earned his PhD in clinical and cross-cultural psychology. He is a fellow of the Michigan Psychological Association for his work with hundreds of combat veterans and their families dealing with post-traumatic stress. Won't you please give me a warm Michigan welcome Dr. Kane to the stage. Thank you very much.
Welcome home. Look to your left and look to your right. Literally. Look behind you. Look in front of you. You're among friends. Some of you came with family and friends. Some of you will meet who's next to you at some point during the day. This is May the 15th, 2015. But while we look at this documentary, you might switch back to another time. That's normal if that happens. But stay grounded next to your battle buddy who's next to you, be it your spouse or whoever you know is next to you, because you've looked them in the eye. We know who all of you are, not like the NSA does, but we got your applications, right? And we know you all are either vets or spouses and family members of vets, or working within the vet community, and you got each other's back. You're going to see the most powerful documentary I've ever seen, and I've shown a lot of documentaries throughout my years in terms of Hiroshima or what happened in Cambodia, and this is the real deal. And if anybody has a difficulty with it, you're welcome to exit. We have clinicians and committee members that will meet you in the back just to give you support if you just need to walk it off. But hang in there, because at the end of the documentary, we have a half-hour panel discussion. This was shown at the Pentagon in 2010, and at the end of the premiere showing of the documentary, the VA and DOD had a panel, and you don't want to miss the panel. The panel sets it in context. And that panel discussion is a half-hour discussion at the end of the documentary. So thank you again for all coming, and you will carry with you some new information, hopefully, by being here. I think we're ready. Okay, now we're in for a live presentation this afternoon, and our only challenge is going to be how we're going to put 30 pounds of flour in a 10-pound sack with these three excellent resource people this afternoon. I'm not going to read Dr. Ross's bio. You have that in writing, but what I am going to say is, on a personal note, Forest View Hospital is one of our co-sponsors for this, and they worked in direct relationship with Dr. Ross. He runs a trauma program at the Forest View Hospital here, and one in Texas. And do you still have one in California? And they're internationally known trauma programs. And the first time I met him was 15 years ago when he was in Texas. And I was in Forest View as a psychologist, not as a client. And I was there with my client and a group, and all of a sudden on this huge screen comes Dr. Ross. And he's running a trauma group from Texas in Grand Rapids. And I've never seen live video conferencing, let alone live video group therapy. And it blew me away how he uses his trauma model technique that he's going to talk about today, not only one-on-one, but in groups, but also Texas by way of live video to Grand Rapids. He's cutting edge Canadian psychiatrist who thinks globally and works individually sometimes. Thank you very much, Dr. Ross and Forest View Hospital, for sharing you with us.
Thank you. So the first thing is sound check. Picking up well enough for the back? I said picking up well enough for the back? Okay, you're right. So I'm a psychiatrist, grew up in Canada, moved down to Dallas in '91, and consulted these three programs, one at, what's that place called? Oh, Michigan, yeah, Grand Rapids, Michigan. And one in Dallas where I live, and one in California. And unfortunately, I can't stay for the next two talks because I got to go to the airport to fly back to Dallas. In terms of military experience, I have none. So I've never been in the military, never been in combat, but my dad took shrapnel in the Netherlands very late in the Second World War, and his brother, my uncle, was missing and presumed dead 3 times as a fighter pilot in the Second World War. In fact, survived all 3 times, came back. His first wife died of cancer, his second wife died of cancer, and then his only son, my cousin, was in a very low-level fighter jet training exercise as the training pilot. Engines flared out, they did bail out, and they both died. So that's kind of a lot of trauma for my uncle there. And he just kept on trucking amazingly through the rest of his life. So amazing resilience. And I always say, where do I get off telling a bunch of vets what to do, what to say, what to think, how to live their lives? Well, I don't do any of that. I see myself as an outside consultant who isn't in the firestorm himself and has an outside perspective as a consultant. The expert is the person who's the client, patient, and I'm just the consultant. And that seems to get accepted fairly well most of the time. So what I have here is some slides, which I'm going to go zip, 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 zip through till we get to the last 2. And the slides include my contact information, should anybody want to email me, or get a copy of the paper on suicidal ideation and self-blame in combat veterans, which is basically what I'm going to talk about. So it's published in the American Journal of Psychotherapy, and you can easily get it from me. So I write all kinds of books and have this trauma model therapy that I've developed, which is a therapy method that's based on a trauma model. And the trauma model is a general scientific model of what goes on in the mental health field. A lot of detail to it, a lot of research predictions and so on. And out of that grows the therapy model, and the therapy model has got these basic components to it, most of which I'm not going to talk about at all. So my only point here is that what I'm going to talk about, which is the self-blame, is embedded in a larger context, in a larger therapy model. So I'm going to focus on kind of one slice of the pie, not the whole picture. But basically the components of the model are the problem of attachment to the perpetrator. So this is developed for people who have horrendously abusive, violent, chaotic, dysfunctional family backgrounds. And their problem is how to form a secure attachment, which they have to do because they're mammals in order to survive, to the very people who are their perpetrators, who are going to terrify them, hurt them, maybe even kill them. And so then there's a whole huge chunk of the model that deals with that. And then the locus of control shift, which is the main foundation of what I'm going to talk about here today, which is the self-blame, which I'll get to back in a second. The problem is not the problem. The basic idea is that somebody presents with a problem, such as drinking. Well, it's definitely a problem, especially after the third DUI. But actually the presenting problem is the solution to some problem in the background. What is the function, purpose, context of the drinking? What's it doing for them? Which is to escape bad feelings, bad thoughts, bad situations, things you don't want to deal with. So we're always looking at symptoms, including PTSD symptoms, as the mind-brain person's attempt to solve a problem, not as you're broken, you're defective, you're damaged. It's all adaptational, striving to survive and cope. Just say no to drugs is the kind of addictions part of the model, that nothing's going to happen until you make a really, 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 really deep down, for real commitment to doing the work you need to do. Whether it's on PTSD, drugs, alcohol, eating disorder. Addiction is the opposite of desensitization. It would take a little while to explain, but basically it's all the stuff that you're avoiding. Thoughts, feelings, memories, internal states, outside situations. You say no to your drug, which is all your avoidance strategies, and little bit by little bit, systematically, step by step, in a very structured way, you start feeling, dealing with it, feeling, dealing with it. And then the rescuer, perpetrator, victim triangle is just a way that we kind of track, is the person in the victim role, or is that perpetrator role behavior, or are you expecting me to be the rescuer? And we talk about that a lot in therapy. So now I'm just going to hop through these slides. So usually if I'm doing like a half-day talk, I'll spend a lot of time on all of these elements. But now we're getting to locus of control shift. And this comes from working with survivors of childhood trauma, who 30 years later are coming in, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, into the thousands, in one way or another saying, I'm bad, I caused it, I deserved it, it was my fault, I was spawn of Satan or whatever. So blaming yourself for the childhood abuse and neglect. So I thought, well, why do people do that? That's ridiculous. No child deserves to be abused or neglected. And I kind of thought about it and puzzled it out and came up with this simple model, which is, we're talking about the mind of the magical child. Little person who's this tall. And there's tons of mental health research and journals of psychology full of experiments looking into this. But a little person is at the center of the world, whole world revolves around them, and they have this magical power to make things happen. That's just how your kid's brain processes it. So when you're in a big trauma family, lo and behold, I'm at the center of the world, I'm causing all this to happen, it's my fault. So it's just automatically how your brain processes the information and creates a theory to explain what's going on. I'm being abused because I'm bad. And so that's kind of interesting. But what's the real core point here? So I always use the example of a little 4-year-old girl. Everything's not too bad in her family. All of a sudden, dad moves out. No big trauma abuse history. So what happened to that little girl? Her future just crashed. She feels powerless, helpless, overwhelmed, trapped. She can't fix it. She can't escape it. Who wants to feel that way? So she thinks to herself, okay, wait a minute. Why doesn't Daddy live here anymore? Oh, it's because I didn't keep my bedroom tidy. So she shifts the locus of control from inside the adults, where it really is, to inside herself. The cause of Daddy not living here anymore is I didn't keep my bedroom tidy. So that means I'm a bad little girl. I don't deserve to have a daddy. But it's also good news, because now I've identified the problem. I've contained it within myself. It's the badness of myself that caused all this to happen. And all I have to do is decide to be a good little girl. Daddy will figure that out. He'll see I've tidied up my bedroom. He'll move back in. Everything will be okay. So it's this developmentally protective illusion of power, control, and mastery that's so reinforcing. So you hold on to the badness of the self to hold on to the illusion of power and control, because at the core of PTSD is the fact that you couldn't control it, couldn't avoid it, couldn't fix it, couldn't escape it. That's what's, it's not the whole story, but that's a big part of the trauma of trauma. So that's the basic model. So when I'm explaining this to therapists, I've got to take a whole half day, but you guys are so quick to catch on. I'll just do it in a few minutes. So the locus control shift is the basic idea here, and it's just the way human beings work. And the mind of the magical child doesn't go away as you grow up. In fact, that would be a disaster if it went away. If you got rid of your magical child mind, you'd have no spontaneity, no awe, no creativity, no science, no art, no religion. You'd just be a Relbet who is functioning well. So healthy development is integrating this magical child mind. We're never perfectly integrated, but when we have this magical child thinking and we get big trauma, then the magical child mind gets activated. The grown-up thinking mind tends to get shut down. So your cortex shuts down, your limbic system gets overactivated and floods everything, and you're looking at it and processing it from, I'm at the center of the world, I caused it all, it's all my fault. So we just take that into the military situation. And one of the science predictions of the trauma model is, if you take 1,000 guys and expose them to roughly the same amount of combat, and you can control for that statistically, you can make a fairly accurate guess prediction as to who's going to get full-on, obvious, visible PTSD and who's not. It won't be a perfect prediction, but you can pigeonhole people one or the other direction based on their childhood trauma. So the guy who's got tons of physical abuse, sexual abuse, family violence, neglect, loss of parents, throw him into combat, he's more likely to develop PTSD than the guy who had a very solid, nurturing, good environment. And so that can be set up as a research project. You can test it. And the way I explain it in therapy is, okay, so we're in Texas, so high school football is big. So you got two running backs. One's had 3 reconstructive surgeries to his knee. One's never had a knee injury. They both get hit with the same force at the same angle by this gigantic linebacker. Which one's more likely to have a knee injury? So the pre-existing trauma doesn't toughen you up. It makes it easier to kick up into full PTSD. So that's one part of this model. Now we're going to get into the sort of the details and specifics of it. And again, with civilians or with military, I'll talk about suicide as a coin with 2 sides. One side I call the euthanasia side. And basically our trauma programs are suicide programs. That's mostly what people are there for. The euthanasia side is what you've just been telling me, which is, it's too much, I can't take it any longer, it's too much pain, I'm done, I gotta give. So it's basically the same as the 17-year-old dog who's much beloved, been a great dog for 17 years. First of all, he got cataracts, then he got arthritis, and now he's got cancer, now he's losing control of his bowel and bladder. So you take the dog to the vet to be put to sleep. Not because you're angry at him, it's an act of love. And so that's the way people talk about their suicide. It's self-care, self-soothing. I'm just letting myself out of this cruel world so I can get some relief. which is true. There's that side of the coin. It's real. It exists. But I want to talk about the other side of the coin. The other side of the coin is it's a violent, hostile, angry murder of a human being. And the reason I want to talk about that is I want to get into the anger, self-blame, self-hatred, self-punishment that's also driving the suicide. It's only one side of the coin. It's not the whole story. But if you don't look at the anger, self-blame, self-hatred side, you're not dealing with a lot of the energy and drive to suicide. So that's just generally how I look at suicide. Then when we put it into the military situation, I'll get some examples in a second. So we're in Texas, which is a death row state. You may think you're in Michigan, but we're in virtual Texas right now. So we're in Texas, it's a death row state. And so I'm working with somebody who's acutely, intensely suicidal. And I'll say, okay, so you've basically got yourself on death row. You've got a death sentence hanging over your head. And in Texas, what do you have to do to get on death row? And somebody might go, oh, I don't know, what do you mean, what are you talking about? I'm not a lawyer. Well, we all basically know it's like first-degree capital murder. You've got to kill somebody. You can't get on death row for stealing from the candy store. You can't even get on death row for robbing a bank or raping somebody. You've got to kill them, and it can't be self-defense. Okay, so that's how you get on death row. So people on death row have committed a crime. What's the crime that you committed? And if it's a childhood abuse case, the crime is causing my parents to abuse me or neglect me. And if it's sexual abuse by dad, then it's causing my poor, helpless dad to have to sexually abuse me because I said this, did this, didn't say that, wore this. There's some explanations. And then I have to deal with, well, wait a minute. It doesn't matter you were 6 years old. It doesn't matter if you took off all your clothes and ordered your dad to have sex with you. His job as an adult is to say no. There's no behavior that a child can do that forces a poor, helpless adult to sexually abuse the child. This is locus control shift, and we talk about and explain locus and control shift. And therefore, you've got yourself, you're the prosecuting attorney, you're the jury, you're the judge, you're the prison warden, and you're the parole board all rolled into one. And you've got yourself on death row for what crime? And then we have to do a lot of work to get the person to realize, okay, it's not reasonable to blame this little child for anything that went on in the family. Therefore, the child didn't commit the crime. Therefore, the sentence should be commuted. We should have a quick parole board hearing. The person's on the way home. So obviously, this takes a bunch of work, but I'm giving you the basic logic. And I'll talk to people about, okay, so your crime was you did such and such. What do you think is like a reasonable sentence for that? How many years in jail? And they'll be, oh, I don't know. Well, here you are, you're 47, so you've been in jail for 40 years. Like, have you done your time, or what exactly is your sentence? So I'm getting them to think, wait a minute, maybe I've already overdone it. Maybe I didn't ever deserve to be in jail. But maybe I could let myself out now, which would be an act of kindness towards myself, an act of forgiveness, commute the sentence, vacate the conviction. I was just a little kid. Therefore, I don't have to be punished in the form of negative self-talk, self-damaging behaviors, death threats, or actually executing myself. So that's placing oneself on death row. And then when we get to the combat, the person will be on death row because of some, quotes, war crime that they perpetrated. So that's more like the general background aspect of it. And now we're going to get a little bit into the specifics. And I'll try and keep track of the time. So survivor guilt. So I went to medical school, went to 4 years of psychiatry residency, and I heard a little brief mention of people who survived the Nazi death camps had survivor guilt. And I just remember thinking, wow, why would you be guilty about surviving Auschwitz? That doesn't make any sense. And nobody explained it further. We never really dealt with it, diagnosed it, treated it. It was just one of those things that was mentioned briefly as some historical item. Then I'm working with combat veterans and childhood abuse survivors, and it's a tsunami of survivor guilt. I'm bad because I survived. Why? So an example in an incest family would be the most excruciating situation, or one of the most excruciating situations, is that there's the two sisters in the bedroom, and dad comes in to molest one or the other. So if you're the older sister, what are your options? Your options are pretend to be asleep so that you've triaged your dad to abuse your sister. So then you're guilty of protecting yourself and inflicting sexual abuse on your sister. The other option is to protect your sister by enticing your dad to come to you, by rustling around or waking up or say, "Hi, Dad," or whatever it might be. So then you've failed to protect yourself, but you've protected your sister, but you've got to be the little slut who seduced her dad. Those are your two options. The heartless person who inflicted sexual abuse on sister, or the little slut who seduced dad. That's a very, very, very painful, difficult, bad double bind. And so the person has guilt about every time they survived by triaging dad over that direction. So survivor guilt then also is tied into this fundamental locus of control shift. I'm bad, I caused it, I deserve the abuse. I was so bad, I don't even deserve to survive, which is why I have myself on death row. But I don't actually execute myself because that would be getting off too easy. What I deserve is endless torment on this earth. What form does the torment take? Negative self-talk, self-blame, self-punishment, self-hatred, pictures of post-traumatic stress disorder flashing back over and over and over. I don't deserve peace. So rather than the brain is just kind of stuck in a loop with PTSD symptoms, the idea here is there's actually some logic to this. It's childhood magical thinking logic, which is totally normal for that part of the brain. But there's actually a very good reason to stay stuck in PTSD, which is you deserve that punishment and you don't deserve the peace because of the crimes you've committed. Point being that there weren't really any crimes at all. So getting into kind of the specifics of combat. So these are all examples I've worked with people multiple times. Self-blame for death of a fellow soldier, probably top of the list. And so, again, here I am, this civilian guy who's never been in combat, and I'm going to explain to this veteran why he's not looking at or she, I've also worked with women from combat, why he isn't thinking about this accurately. So it seems a little presumptuous. Point being, I'm trying to help the guy step out of his child mind into his adult mind and sit beside me and look back at the workings of his child mind. That's where I could be of use. Because if I was just sucked into the PTSD and he told me a combat story and then I had a flashback myself, I'd just be in there with him. I wouldn't be available as a consultant. So a typical scenario, we were in a firefight in Iraq or Afghanistan. There was a sniper bullet came and my buddy beside me died. So there's one of two things that had happened immediately before that. One is, 30 seconds before, I told my buddy to change positions with me for some extremely good, like combat-related, sensible reason. If I hadn't asked my buddy to change positions, then the bullet would have hit me, which is what I deserved, and he would have survived, so his death is my fault, so I'm a murderer. Oh, okay. But then I've also worked with people where the scenario is they didn't ask their buddy to change positions. And that's why the buddy died, and that's why it's their fault. So then I kind of break it down, basically. And the spirit of this is not, let me tell you how it is. The spirit is, okay, walk me through this step by step by step by step. And then I just ask questions. Okay, so you're in this big firefight, so there's bullets flying all over the place. And I might even have to back out to, okay, hold on. in the history of the human race, has anybody ever died in warfare? Yes, okay. Have American soldiers died in a whole series of war? Yes. Have American soldiers, whichever it is, Iraq, Afghanistan, died in Iraq? Yes. So all of those, so if the guy was the platoon commander or something, all of those platoon leaders who had people die were negligent and should be sued for war crimes, right? Well, I know they're not going to agree with that. So I've taken their self-blame and I've exaggerated it up to be huge, and I've applied it to another soldier. And they're immediately going to go, there's no way. People die in war. Those are good soldiers. We shouldn't be blaming them. He tried his best. Okay, and what's the difference between that soldier over there and somebody died under his command and your situation? I should have prevented it. So I'm just trying to get a little bit of, maybe the attitude towards me could be the same as my attitude towards my fellow soldiers. Okay, so let's walk through it then. So there's all these bullets going off all over the place. So why didn't you, so you can, just by listening to me, you can tell me I've never been in the military, never been in combat. There's all these bullets flying all over the place. So the sniper was where? I don't know exactly. Oh, well, why didn't you know exactly? Well, because I didn't look. Okay, you didn't look. So snipers in general are kind of stumble-bum guys who don't know how to get anything accomplished? No. Are snipers, some are better than others, but are they like highly trained, really tricky, very good at hiding? They can make an accurate shot from a great distance away. And snipers on all sides of all combats have a lot of kills added up. Right. So not only did you fail to see this sniper who was invisibly hidden in a sniper's nest somewhere, hundreds of yards away, what about all the other clowns in your unit? So I may not say clowns, but it's the same idea. Or sometimes I'll say it to really kind of like ramp the point up. How come they failed to see where the sniper was? Well, they were busy and they were being shot at and they had, okay, so how come they all don't deserve to die for failing to spot the sniper? So the guy is forgiving everybody else in the unit, but not forgiving himself. So again, I want to step outside of the self and look at the reality of the situation, which is the sniper was highly concealed. Nobody else spotted him. He's probably got lots of kills before and after. And how are you supposed to predict the exact angle that the bullet came at and the exact time it was going to come at? And how are you supposed to know in advance that you shouldn't ask the guy to change positions? And so this is like so simple and so obvious, but when you're in the self-blame and in that traumatized child mind perspective, you can't quite process it and see it. And then the conclusion is, I guess I couldn't. And this is a 50 to 60 minute therapy session where the guy actually gets to, I never looked at it that way. I guess it's just not my fault. Okay, so if it's not your fault, then you didn't commit negligent homicide and you don't deserve to be tried and you don't deserve to be on death row. True. So what is it that's actually the problem here? And this is true of locus control shift all the time. The problem is not that you were the dirty little girl who caused her dad to have sex with her. The actual problem is that you were just an innocent child who deserved to be loved and treated decently. It didn't happen through no fault of your own. It wasn't under your control. It was your parents' junk. And so what's actually true? What's actually true is you were powerless, helpless, trapped, scared, overwhelmed, couldn't fix it, couldn't escape it. That's the trauma. And who wants to know that? Who wants to feel that? Nobody in their right mind. So you don't, and one way you don't is you can get drunk, you can do this, you can do that, you can shut down. Another way is to blame yourself. You don't have to feel the powerlessness and the helplessness if you're all wrapped up in, I had the power, I had the control, I just didn't exercise it the way I should have and could have. So the self-blame is the solution to the underlying problem of You couldn't save that guy. It wasn't within your control. And that, to put it mildly, sucks really bad. And then sometimes it's astounding how unrealistic the scenario can be in the child mind. So the guys, they're in a convoy, and the front vehicle hits the IED, blows up in the air, and the buddy is incinerated. So the guy who's 5 vehicles back is explaining to me how that's his fault. I'm like, how could anybody ever think that? Well, again, I remind myself, that's the way human beings process information. When the child mind is flooded up and the grown-up thinking cerebral cortex mind has gotten basically shut down, and there's an override. Okay, so explain to me how you were supposed to have prevented that. Well, we take turns, and I was supposed to be in the lead vehicle, but something or other happened, and the commanding officer said, no, you go in that vehicle today. Oh. So you have the option of disobeying a direct command. No. If you disobeyed the direct command and got in the front vehicle, what would happen? Somebody would boot you out of there and send you back to where you're supposed to be. Okay, so how are you supposed to be in control of which vehicle you were in? How are you supposed to make it happen that you were in the lead vehicle? And again, you laboriously go through it, and the person kind of starts to get it. Well, okay, wasn't under my control. Then it's, well, what I should have done is I should have gotten to the burning vehicle in time to save him. Okay, so how many yards are we talking about, basically? Okay, so about 50 yards. And so the first thing that happened was this explosion in the vehicle going up in the air. And before the vehicle got to the ground, the entire interior of the vehicle was engulfed in flames. True? True. So what's the fastest you could sprint 50 yards? 5 seconds if you're an Olympic sprinter. Okay, so if you had gotten there in 5 seconds instead of 15, 20 seconds like it took you, what would have happened? I would have been able to save him. You would have been able to save him because he had been totally engulfed in flames for 5 seconds at many, many hundreds of degrees Celsius. It's just not scientifically possible and true. And so it's always a matter of stepping out, looking at it analytically with the adult mind, and going, the fact of the matter is I didn't commit that crime. Therefore, I don't deserve the punishment. The punishment being suicide. Now I'm going to subdivide civilians and atrocities. So I've never actually personally worked with somebody who's been convicted of a major league war crime. But every combat person I work with is self-convicted of war crimes. So it kind of gets out into a gray zone and a little bit over the gray zone. So a gray zone picture is, which I then reeled it back into, this is just warfare. So we're in Iraq, there's a situation, and it's just like on the American Sniper movie. There's a kid walking, so there's a building here with enemy in it, and there's our unit over here, and there's a kid walking across the space. How do we know if he's a suicide bomber or not? And it's wait, shot him, and then it turns out he didn't have a suicide bomb on. So therefore, I'm a child murderer. It's okay, so we have to, again, adult thinking cap, walk through it. How did you know in advance that this kid did not have explosives on him? I didn't. Okay, how could you have known? I couldn't. Okay, so in this situation, it turned out that he didn't. But what if he did, and what if you didn't pull the trigger? What would have happened? Well, then the kid would have died anyway, and a whole bunch of my buddies would have died. So you're supposed to roll the dice on that? It would be a good combat decision to go, well, maybe it's just a kid. I'll take a chance on that. Why would any kid be walking through this space with all this combat going on anyway? It doesn't make sense. Turned out that he didn't have anything on him. This is why war is horrible. This doesn't make you a murderer. This makes you somebody who's doing his job, doing his duty, and that's why you were never charged with a war crime. Like, what's the matter with the military? They're so slack they don't ever charge people with war crimes? If they thought that you committed an unnecessary murder of a civilian and all kinds of people testified to it, surely there would be a court-martial, wouldn't there? So there wasn't a court-martial. Why? Either because the military is too slack to prosecute you, or there was no crime. Which one do you think it is? So we're going around and around and around the same issues all the time. And the scenarios just vary. So we pour a whole bunch of rounds into a building, we go in there and there's dead civilians in there. Or we're driving along and it's the same road where an IED went off last week, and there's a kid there and he's got a backpack, or he's lying down in suspicious fashion, or something's going on. And it's always the same basic thing. Literally in the heat of battle, we made a split-second decision. Okay, if we go back in time and review that decision, was it in fact the wrong decision? What would have happened if you hadn't made that decision? Then the vehicle would have got blown up, somebody would have died. So it's the same logic, but it's just different content and different combat scenarios over and over and over and over and over. Another version of it was, my job is getting, I think it was a general, high-ranking guy anyway, to this point, this point, this point, this meeting, this meeting, this meeting on time. And this guy was always behind schedule 10 or 15 or 20 minutes, and I had to like corral him and set everything up, and he was notorious for being late for meetings. So the problem is that this day, the general was 15 minutes behind schedule. So they went by this point in the town 15 minutes later than they should have. And at that point, the 7-year-old kid was lying, who he knew personally, was lying dead on the ground because they failed to go through 15 minutes earlier, spot the enemy, take him out, preventing the firefight, preventing the death of the kid. So therefore, he was a child murderer, and he deserved execution. And so again, I had to go, okay, so you can just like yell at the general and tell him to move his butt and get in the Jeep? Not exactly. You can't give the general orders. And he drags his feet, and this happens day after day after day after day for many, many, many months. And all those other days when he's dragging his feet and he's 10 or 15 minutes late for meetings, nothing happens. So what was different on that day? Well, that was the day the kid was going to die. Right, but how did you know in advance? How could you have known? How should you have known? And so this guy is like 6'3", linebacker type character, special forces guy, tough, emotionally shut down. And within 45 minutes of conversation, he's bawling and saying he just wants to go back to Afghanistan and tell the mother he's sorry. That's it. This is this horrible monster who deserves to be executed for the war crime of killing the child. So self-blame for being raped by a fellow soldier. So according to so there was a discussion on the video panel there. What's the percent of people who come back from combat who have PTSD? So the VA was saying 20%. Then is pushing up. Another guy in the panel said 30%. But the guy who really knew what was going on said 100%. So now, that doesn't mean that 100% of people actually meet all the checklist items in the DSM for PTSD. But the percentage who are not deeply affected is basically zero. And so, okay, you don't have full PTSD, but you sure got a bunch of it. And some days you got more than others. So as we were talking at lunchtime, psychiatry is obsessed with putting people in diagnostic boxes. You have PTSD or you don't. If you have PTSD, that's great because you can get services. Well, by the way, you can't get promoted and you can't get any respect and you can't go back. But we'll help you. We'll help you by giving you treatment. So the system is all set up to incredibly reward and incredibly punish people who get in the box. And then everybody who's not in the box is just totally normal. And psychiatrists talk this way all the time. You have schizophrenia. I don't, I'm normal. You've got a genetic defect. I don't, I'm normal. There's something wrong with your brain. You've got PTSD. I don't. Psychiatrists talk that way all the time. It's sort of okay, as I was saying at lunch, if you have somebody who's drunk a bottle of vodka every day for the last 10 years, they got an alcohol problem. They're in the box of alcohol problem. Somebody who never drinks is not in the box. But there's all this huge number of people who are on this sort of gray zone in the middle, where one guy drinks a beer a day, one couple extra beers on the weekend, another guy has 2 beers every night, can't get to sleep without a 3rd beer, 12-pack on the weekend. Where's the cutoff between the people who are in the box and the people who are out of the box? In that gray zone in the middle, he maybe likes alcohol a lot, he overuses it a little, it's not that much of a problem. Well, of course, his wife just left him because he drinks too much. But it's not officially an alcoholic. This is the way we do PTSD. You're either in the box or out, and the overriding reality is, sure, some people are in the box, and sure, some people have no PTSD, but of all these combat guys coming back from intense combat involvement, the number who are totally out of the box, I don't think is very big. But according to the VA, if you're returning, well, if you're female, period, and in the forces, or if you're female and you've been deployed, and you come back with PTSD, this is not according to some conspiracy theorist. This is the official word of the VA. The most frequent cause of PTSD in female soldiers, armed forces personnel, is rape by American armed forces personnel. So this is same as the rape on campus problem, which is out of control, gigantic, institutionally denied. What happens if you go, say, base commander, my immediate commanding officer raped me last night. Career over. Stigma, exclusion at the individual sort of social level of the unit, and institutionally from top down. All disavowed, denied. No, we're not doing that around here. We support our troops. But the way the whole culture works is, talk about stigma. The stigma of being a rape victim in the military is your career's over. In some of those highly civilized countries over in the Middle East, like Pakistan, women get killed by their family for disgracing the family by being raped. And women actually get convicted of the crime of being raped. Okay, but that's over there. Well, we don't quite go that far, but we go part that way. To blame, stigmatize, punish. And so when I'm talking with a civilian rape victim, so it's lots and lots and lots of childhood trauma, but also lots of adult, high school, college, and adulthood rape that I hear about all the time too in civilians. Over and over and over and over and over and over and over. I shouldn't have worn that dress. I shouldn't have put on that lipstick. I shouldn't have gone to that bar. I shouldn't have given my phone number. I shouldn't have started making out with them. I shouldn't have. And that's why it happened. It's my fault. So that's the same locus control shift. You blame yourself, and then so I'll make counter arguments like, okay, so if a woman's literally on the street selling her body for sex, does that mean it's legitimate, just go rape her anytime you want? No, no way. Yeah, but she's on the street selling her body for sex. Even then, raping that woman is a crime. What makes it rape? No consent, or actively withholding consent, physically or verbally. Okay. So how come it's not okay to rape a prostitute and it's your fault that that guy raped you? So I'm always trying to get them to go, oh, wait a minute. take how I see this other person and put that perception on me. Have the same victim empathy that I have for that person for myself. And so it's exactly the same thing in the military, except the story then is much compounded by, it was my fault, I did this, I did that, I should have said no, I couldn't. Then it's I couldn't say no, I was physically overpowered, then I should have told somebody. Well, why didn't you tell somebody? Well, by the time they get to me, they have told somebody usually. And then there's all the consequences. So when I was not long out of my residency program in the frozen north there, even north of Michigan, I was talking to a young woman who had, she had PTSD and other things from a whole bunch of childhood sexual abuse that her sister was also involved in. And it was the first person who ever explained to me, the sexual abuse was bad, but then we got the reputation of being the town sluts. That was even a bigger trauma than the actual acts of sexual abuse. So the institutional response was more of a driver of the PTSD than the traumatic event. Welcome to the culture of the military. Welcome to the culture of the Catholic Church. Welcome to the culture of the university or college campus. And then self-blame for failure to protect loved ones post-deployment is another theme. I'm going to leave some time for question and discussion here. So the way I learn all of this, which I explain in therapy sessions and explain at workshops, how do I get to be the expert who wrote the books and wrote the papers and goes around and tells everybody how to think and what to do? The way I learn this is somebody who's designated as a patient because they're in a hospital. If they were in a psychology practice, they'd be a client. Has got some symptoms and some behavior. And I go, why do you do that? So explain to me how it makes sense to you to believe that about yourself. How is it helping you to do that behavior, which can be like slashing your wrist? Well, because when I slash my wrist, the bad feelings are gone right away. So it's actually self-soothing, self-management. It makes sense, it gets the job done, but it's a little bit self-destructive. So what I want to do is kind of shift the person from this out-of-control, borderline personality, mental health wreck person who's cutting her wrist to somebody who's smart, an adult, dedicated to self-soothing, self-management, trying to make life bearable, get through the next day. And you've found a technique that actually works. Problem is it's kind of destructive on your skin. And then you got to go to the ER, get sewn up, and you get trash talked behind your back at the ER. And then you're a bad borderline, and they got this label in the mental health system. So let's stay with the basic mission. Self-soothing, self-care, survival, self-management. We just want to tweak the method a little bit. So I've just redefined somebody as smart, dedicated to self-management, self-soothing, and just needs a little tweaking on some of the strategies. Now that's something that's a doable project. Going from this decayed mental health wreck whose brain isn't working right, who's acting out all over the place, who has symptoms and maybe abnormal genes, to quotes normal, that's an impossible, overwhelming journey, and how would you even get started? But going from somebody who's basically normal is showing the impact of trauma that's just normal, just like you hit the tree when you're skiing, your leg's broken. Nobody's going, what's wrong with that person genetically? Why do they have the broken leg? Everybody just goes, well, yeah. Same thing with PTSD. It's more, yeah, well, what do you expect? Now they're trying to cope with this as best they can, but the strategies are a little bit self-destructive, such as killing yourself. So it's the same themes, whether it's military trauma or civilian trauma. So it's kind of like when somebody asks me about cross-cultural things. So I've published a whole bunch of cross-cultural papers. So I noticed that some people are white, some people are Chinese, some people are black, some people are... And I noticed that people speak different languages, and they wear different clothes, and they live in different countries. It's not like I don't notice that, but I'm more interested in what everybody has in common. Same with military trauma and civilian trauma. Obviously, there's differences. And one difference is that the combat veteran can tell his combat story in a group setting with female childhood sexual abuse survivors, and they don't get triggered. Whereas if a female childhood sexual abuse survivor told a graphic, detailed, gory story of dad sexually abusing her, all the women would be like totally triggered and all over the place. So I see that there's a difference, but I'm more interested in the commonalities. And one thing I learned was by having a guy explain to me. So it's the story we heard over and over on the video. He never came back. And it's like what happened, his brain got damaged. No, as you'll hear in the next hour, trauma definitely affects the biology of your brain. How would it not? If your mind is hurt, your brain has to in some way be involved in being hurt. Unless you're already dead and your mind is totally disconnected from your body, that would be the only possible exception. But if you're here on Earth, you can't have severe mental health disturbance going on and everything's calm and okay in your brain. It's just impossible. So here's this guy he's back from combat in the Middle East. And I remember when those guys were stuck in the mine in Chile a couple of years ago. Completely civilian situation. Nobody died, but they were down there a long time. They got back up, and one of these guys literally put a wall all the way around his house. Well, why? He'd never been in combat. Nobody was going to attack him. He was just trying to feel safe. So it's not about combat uniquely in and of itself, but when you've got combat, then that just ramps it all up. So this guy comes back, and he's the patrolling the perimeter kind of guy. He's up at night. He's got wife and kids. He literally patrols the perimeter. He's patrolling the neighborhood, totally keyed up, revved up, looking for danger. He's on it. And the calm, easygoing, I love you, you love me, dad / husband, he's just not around. There's just this keyed up combat veteran guy, and there could be mortar fire coming in any second to a suburban house in California. So what's really going on here? So we could do the stuck brain model. But I asked him, and lo and behold, the story I get is, it's his fault that the buddy died. Okay, so I've heard that story before. But what's the vow? What's keeping him stuck in PTSD? The vow is, nobody's going to die on my watch again, equals wife and kids. So he's putting all this energy into not fouling up for a second time. Of course, the thing is, he didn't foul up the first time. And the other thing is, I just did I can never remember, I saw it in a movie once. When you're at DEFCON 1, I don't know if DEFCON 1's the highest or the lowest, I can't remember which way the scale goes. But when you're at high alert and all the jets are scrambled and the guy's got his finger on the button in the silo, that's because there's this huge threat. So the level of hyperarousal and alert matches the threat. But your threat analysis is off. Come on, so I'm the civilian. Come on, let's get some military skills up and going here. As a threat assessment, this is way off. If you did this kind of threat assessment in the military, you'd be like blowing up the village in France instead of attacking the compound in Iraq. So I got him to realize that his threat assessment is off, that the kids aren't in that much danger. Sure, could get hit by a driver when they're out on their bike. Welcome to the world. So to realize two things. First of all, his threat assessment is off, therefore his scrambled jets level is way too high. So it could be conceivable to let the DEFCON alert down to here without exposing the kids to excessive danger. And even if they get hurt, that's life, it's not preventable, and it wouldn't be the second crime because there was no first crime. So getting all that to sink in was like, oh. And that's kind of the way I work. So we have a couple of minutes. We're just going to go click into the next presentation. We're not taking a break. So thought, question, anything not clear? It's a little hard to see the audience here. If not, we could take a brief pause and on to the next one. Thank you.
One other thing I want to say about Dr. Ross in Forest View is those of you that are social workers, you got your free CEUs today, thanks to Forest View. And Forest View Hospital and Dr. Ross make themselves available for us clinicians for free consultations at the hospital, to spend a day at the hospital to observe the trauma program, or even consultations with Dr. Ross, which I've taken advantage of many times. So another resource in the community. So those of you that are clinicians, check with Matt at the Forest View table if you're interested. Okay, we're going to switch to our next talk, and then we are going to take a break after this next talk, so there will be a break. Again, I'm not going to read the bio that you already have in your hands. Dr. Ted Major, I've known for a number of years as well as Dr. Ross. When I first met Dr. Major, he was doing his residency in psychiatry after working as a primary care physician. And he was cutting edge, providing mental health services to community mental health, doing case management. He went on and developed the psychiatric medical unit at St. Mary's Hospital, one of 2 centers in the state where for medical and psychiatric inpatient treatment. He was the director and the medical director of that. He's now one of the top neuropsychiatrists and the clinical director of Hope Network. And they have a major grant from the DOD to provide residential treatment for moderate to severe combat TBIs. And please check that information out on the Hope Network table out in the lobby as well. But it's really a pleasure to and very thankful that Dr. Major has taken the time to share with us today. Again, I don't know how he's going to get all the information out to us that he has at his PowerPoint or in his head, but I'm so glad he's going to try and share with us the information about combat TBI. Dr. Major.
Well, that'll be easy. I'll just rob time from the next person.
Here you go.
By the way, with his permission, I want to make a comment on Dr. Kane's initial welcome. Did you hear stigma? Did you hear stigma? What did you hear? I was not a patient. I was there as staff. Laughter. That is institutional stigma. Those of you who have been conscious of racial issues also know about institutional racism, the kind of racism that individuals are just not aware of because it's so built in. By the way, I had his permission to mention that, but mostly to sensitize us, because one of the questions that come up is, what can we do about stigma? Well, it starts here, and I'm not innocent. My presentation is coming from a different angle than Dr. Ross's is. He's not here to defend himself, so I can say what I will. His model comes from developmental issues, that's what causes the brain not to be normal. I'm coming from after development damage to the brain, physical damage to the brain versus developmental damage. Does developmental damage physically damage the brain? Absolutely. When does it start? It starts with mother's postpartum depression, where she is not bonding with her infant. Once that happens, the person never feels like the world is safe. It can't happen. Intellectually, you can do this exercise, know the world is safe and stuff like that, but it doesn't happen. For the mother, and there's some bias here, but for the mother, nursing itself induces her brain to make a chemical called oxytocin, which actually creates bonding. So there are actually things that happen. Changes the brain for both the mother and the infant in those first few months that then is permanent. He called it attachment, and that's exactly the right words. So I don't want to distinguish physical He did make one distinction that I'm not comfortable with, and that has to do with Descartes. You remember Descartes? He said there's a mind in the body and they're separate, and the mind is a monkey in the works. We bought into that model, and frankly, I don't accept it. I think we are one thing that we distinguish just to try to make sense out of it. By the way, you've had lunch and you've had a lecture. You may have neurofatigue, which is a symptom of brain injury. I want to find out. I want you to put your hand on something hard, and I'll do a neurofatigue test. The test is if I tap, you tap. But if I tap twice, you don't do anything. Let your brain just relax. I'd better try it. Oh, come on, stay on the ball. It's got to be right on the chart. Go ahead and get some caffeine. Okay. If you haven't guessed by yet, I use humor. Occasionally my humor is offensive. It may be offensive here. If so, I apologize. I will attend to not being offensive, but I know humor innately has covert anger in it, so humor always carries the risk of offensiveness. That's okay. Another thing that happens, especially with this group, is the question of who is the patient. The last speaker kind of tried to, well, is this a patient, is this a client, or what it is? We may not always use it that way, but those of you who know the old foreign languages, what is a patient? A patient is one who suffers. That's all it means. I've got a person in the chair in front of me. Is that the patient? It may be. In this population, not necessarily. The patient may be the wife. She may be the one that's suffering. It may be emergency room. It may be the boss. If I don't attend to that, I'm going to be giving treatment to the wrong person. I'm going to be imposing treatment on the person that's not the patient. Big important distinction for us, especially since as a psychiatrist, and I'm a more medical psychiatrist, we use medications. And we're giving chemicals to somebody who may not be the patient. Not that they're not ill. The client, by the way, is one who leans and gains support from the other person. This is also a problem because we're teaching this individual not to stand on their own 2 feet, but to need us. And that also carries its own problems, right? By the way, there are individuals who are in therapy situations who do like people leaning on them, and that in itself is an intrinsic problem. Starting with blast injury, this has been called the signature wound or injury of current wars, current police actions. And that's valid because we are seeing much more of that. My first experience with that was I was 6 or 7, and my mother developed a supportive relationship with an Electrolux salesman. I know you don't know that word, probably don't know the other word that I know, and that's called VCR. But she said, when I checked, he seems to sort of act different. He has shell shock, and his brain was shocked by shells in World War II. It's been called other things previous to that, but it's very clear that we have been aware of this and the impact of it. Commented to my group, one of the first episodes that I'm aware of happened to a fellow named King Saul, related to King David, not in a friendly way. And he had an injury, and his response to it was suicide. So as far as I know, the first response to injury that's been recorded is suicide. And that's not new. That's old. Okay. What is unique about the blast injury? The sudden impact on the brain that absolutely does not show. Absolutely does not show. You can be aware, oh, this person was near a blast, but it does not show. Even other brain injuries can have that same quality, but it is in spades in the brain injury. As you may be aware, part of the problem for me is I know there's various levels of education and training, but the main impact is on the hollow organs. Those of you who are divers know about the bends. Bends is when you have a blast injury, much more mild, from going from a pressure environment to a low pressure environment, and it involves some of these same things. The hollow organs get most of the impact, so we're talking lungs. We're also talking about inner ear, so we're going to be talking about long-term balance problems, and you get air emboli from the sudden changes in pressure, where then the air ends up in the blood vessels and then goes around to other parts, including the brain. The soft tissue obtains damage in a way that it doesn't with the other injuries because there is actual internal architectural problem. The cell itself, the nucleus of the cell, looks different and is diffuse. This is microwave versus oven. How does the microwave cook? From the inside out. That is not true with the other kinds of injury. You have a new injury where the cells themselves are what's damaged. Specifically and uniquely, there are two groups that are damaged. Well, let me do this first. Oops. I guess I didn't get the video. There's a video here just to give you a sense.
No, you got it. I'm all about IT here.
Good, because I am challenged, as you know, for my comment about VCR.
Pounds of gunpowder explode, but the shockwave is completely invisible. So we need to slow it down over 100 times, and then watch it back repeatedly from several angles. In 1,000th of a second, the gunpowder ignites. In 1/1,000,000th of a second, it changes from solid to gas. And there it is. Finally, we can see the shockwave.
That's the wave. See the wave outside the explosion. Now watch the wave go up. Where is it now?
A wall of intense high pressure
See the wave going
in
up.
the air.
Explosion's down here, but the wave is already up here. And this is
It's
1/100th
traveling
of the
at
actual
over
speed.
300 meters every second.
So what becomes the injury?
So fast that anything in
Air.
its path is punched aside.
Becomes the weapon.
It's the shockwave, not the explosion itself, that causes devastation. In the high-speed world, thin air can create brute force and destruction.
And I think I was talking and shouldn't have. He used the word 300 there. Was I over talking when he said 300? 300 meters. That's the speed that the air, the shock wave is moving. 300 meters per second. 300 meters is 3 football fields. 3 football fields in 1 second. This baby's moving. I mean, we don't have football players that get anywhere near 3 football fields in 1 second. That's what creates the damage, is that sudden. And that's, you can't, even looking carefully at this slowed down mind, you could barely see that shock wave. This is a silent damager slash killer. 2 places it especially damages. This is just a picture of how this erupts. The pressure occurs essentially instantaneously. Huge pressure, and then it drops down and goes slightly below. But it's that sudden rise in pressure that affects the body, the entire body, especially things like the lungs and the inner ear. So I draw this, didn't draw the picture, I got it off the internet. Down here is a part of the body, and we name it after this. This is a sea monster. We often call it a seahorse, but the actual definition of hippocampus is sea monster. So we are taking a sea monster and recognizing it in the body. In the middle of the brain, what does the sea monster do? You don't know probably, that's why I'm giving a lecture. Lays down new memories. Lays down the new connection to memories, and it orients us. If you damage that and you give a rat a maze, that rat cannot find itself around the maze. So visual spatial organization, where am I in time and space, is damaged. And that is unique to the blast injury. It's not true of the other brain injuries. It affects the thalamus. What's the thalamus? What happens there? Existential meaning, religion, sex, politics. All the things that we know, not the things that we know. Adam knew his wife Eve, and then after the fall, he knew his wife. Same word, but a very different experience. So all of those things that we know are damaged here in the thalamus with a blast injury. So that impacts us in every way that's important. Dr. Ross is working from a psychological perspective in an attempt to have the cortex override that, because that middle part of the brain is what's firing. Override that. With these injuries, that's much more difficult to override that, and we'll get into that a bit. What else does a blast injury do? Well, it suddenly jolts the brain. What happens then? The brain slides around. Two parts of the brain, one part of the brain connected to the spine, it's locked in. It can't move. The rest of the brain is doing what? Yes, it's floating in water, and it suddenly changes. What happens? We get sliding. Best way to think about it, I think of, is a mushroom. Your brain's a mushroom. You got the stem, you got the cap. If you twist the cap, it comes off, in which case you're dead. But if you move it a little bit, you get tearing between the two. The cap is fine, the stem is fine, but the communication is off. The limbic system, religion, sex, and politics. What do we call that in our culture? What's the name that we give to the part of the brain that has those? Think Hallmark. Heart. I love you with all my limbic system. That's what men say to their women. And the women are just all over them for that. It's just, no! Take Jesus into your limbic system. Never heard it. I pledge allegiance to the flag. I don't think they do that anymore. But I was brought up. We did it before you started. I'm sorry, I wasn't here this morning. I'm glad we did, because my children have gotten away from that. They do not do that in school today. So, congratulations on maintaining that. Religion, sex, and politics are in your heart. Your heart is not directly connected to your head. And you'll hear talks about that, well, your heart has to go through your neck. And it's valid. There really are cells that run between there. And those cells get damaged. The bodies of the cells, the life of the cell is in the heart. Remember where the heart is? The limbic system. The thinking part is in the brain, the cortex. The cells aren't there. The strings coming out, the axons come out from there. So now we got a situation where the limbic system is activated and all distorted, and it can't talk back and forth to the cortex. So the cortex, like Dr. Ross was talking about, can't make that connection. Now this is not absolute, obviously, right? But this is a trend that way, which makes some difficulty with some of the therapies. Tertiary injury is where you get slammed on the ground and crash. It's called a contra coup injury. It's the only kind of injury they knew when I was in medical school. Just very recently, I think it was in the 80s, we became aware of DAIs, of that part I just talked about. And this whole blast injury thing is very, very new. Then there's all the things that can happen to the body that can affect the brain, burns and chemicals and all those kind of things. So what happens? Various clusters that I like to put together. One cluster is the post-concussion syndrome, otherwise known as encephalopathy, called by neurologists delirium, called by sports fans concussion, or being knocked out or being dazed, where people have to come around and hold the person down for a few seconds until they straighten around, and then they go right back to the sports. Those are encephalopathic syndromes. What happens? The mood is very labile. Bipolar is when you stay high for a while, go low for a while. This goes high for 1 or 2 seconds and goes back down. There's no anchor to it. It's sometimes called bipolar. I really avoid that term if it's happening in any kind of rapid. We get restless, just can't sit still, can't be calm. Just my whole body's just running. Irritability. Anything that goes on is going to irritate me. It's going to bother me. Quit doing that is what's going to go on. Depression. And depression as both psychological and physical. At this point, it's primarily the psychological depression of not being able to do those things. Anxiety, there's 2 kinds of anxiety: cold, sweaty hands anxiety, shake my hand; cold, sweaty. Why? I'm anxious. Then there's anxiety. We call it anxiety in our culture. It's psychic agitation. I feel anxious, but my hand's warm and dry. That's brain anxiety. It's a very different experience. It's much more serious from my perspective, much harder to treat. So if your friend is anxious, but has a warm, dry hand, this is what's going on. It's happening inside their brain. Partly because of all this, when impulses happen, they're going to react right away without thinking. They can't count to 10. Right? That's our culture. Count to 10. Well, maybe they can count to a half, but don't have that time. Or maybe they can count to 3. Very variable. Continuum. Dr. Ross made that comment in terms of, am I PTSD or am I not? It is a continuum. DSM-5 has tried to force us, is it PTSD or isn't it? Under DSM-4, we had NOS, meaning I have some of the symptoms, but not all of them. We have to do one or the other if we want to get paid. There you go. It does influence. Money does influence our behavior. I think I slipped over one. Oh, the somatic disturbances. These are the physical symptoms that you will see. Headache. Why do we see dizziness and vertigo? Inner ear damage. Broken sleep after an injury. You never sleep as deep as you did, and you're never fully awake. Guaranteed. It's an intrate part. What time in your life do you get the deepest sleep? Infants, you're right. And all through the rest of your life, your sleep never gets as deep until you're an old person, in which case sleep remains more shallow, and indeed, all these injuries in some ways age the brain. Personality changes. How do you know if somebody has a personality disorder? Very simple. You don't like them. You can list all the criteria you want. Or be careful, you'll like them too much. In which case, they have the same one you do. Am I right? All right. All right. By the way, in psychiatry, we call things personality disorders when we can't treat it. If I can give you medications, used to be a diagnosis called depressive personality disorder. When did that disappear? When we got antidepressants. Suddenly, now it's a medical illness. If you think I'm cynical, you're right. Okay. Now we've got the frontal lobe syndrome. If it's primarily the frontal lobe, what does the frontal lobe do? It does what Dr. Ross wants us to do. It thinks and regulates and makes choices. It's the boss. It's in charge. When it's working well, it takes charge of everything else. The heart may want to do things. I may be all turned on sexually, but my frontal lobe says, no, you don't keep looking at that woman's breast. You take your eyes off that because that's not acceptable to do. That's my frontal lobe. That's not my limbic system. I think you're getting a little of this message. Temporal limbic syndrome. What is this? This is the temporal lobe, which is actually part of the cortex. How can that cause a problem? Well, electroshock therapy. What does it do? Where do you put the electrodes? You put them on the temporal lobe because that's where the brain seizes. Most seizures start in the temporal lobe. It's electrical disturbance. That part of the brain is injured, a little scar tissue. What does it do? It fires off. It creates a very mild form of epilepsy. The emotions, rather than the shaking of the body, has the same effect of real epilepsy. And number one, it's ictal or non-ictal. How do we know it's ictal? Because we can see it happening on a brainwave test. It's way inside the brain, so most temporal lobe epilepsy, you can't see it. So therefore, it's non-ictal, or awful term they used to. You ever heard the term pseudo-seizure? Means it's made up. Pretty clear that it's almost always due to very deep problems where the electricity is firing off and it's heating up that part of the brain, and that you can see with some of the newer kinds of studies. So again, that part of the brain connected up between the frontal lobe and the limbic system, that's not doing the job it can. So you're seeing some of those same words you just saw. Now we have focal injury, but it creates a lot of the same kinds of things. You do see more specific physical things, hot going through their body, smelling burning rubber and that kind of thing. There can be episodes when a person actually gets psychotic. and it's very brief. We see the same thing with other things. Push any of us hard enough, and those kind of things will happen. In terms of diagnosis, anything at all can happen. Let me show you a little about that, if I can do it easily. Thank you, Elena, for rescuing me.
Yes.
Close inspection of an area of the outer surface of the brain and inner surface of the skull during the initial impact shows the soft, fragile brain scraping against the hard, jagged inner surfaces of the skull to create shearing forces. As the gray matter, comprised of cell bodies, and the white matter, comprised of axons, are of two different densities, the shearing forces create a plane of cleavage where many axonal injuries occur.
This is the stem.
The
of
axons
mushroom.
may be
This is the head
completely
of the mushroom.
torn, partially torn, or separated from their connections with other cells. Thousands or even millions of scattered axons may be torn.
I want to talk about syndromes of symptoms at this point. We talked about what happens in the brain. We've talked about specific areas of the brain. I want to talk about syndromes. And by the way, this is what you treat. You treat the symptoms. You don't treat the diagnosis. Right? By the way, with all these brain injury, we have no approved medications. Fortunate for me, that's true, because I don't like following the rules. So I can use any treatment that is going to be helpful for the person. I don't have to follow algorithms. Nothing is approved. There are no medications that are approved for treating these illnesses. You're not going to see brain injury advertised on TV as the right medicine. The symptoms and signs are different too. The symptoms are what the patient complains of. Signs are what we see, and these get distorted too. Many people with depression, that we call depression, with these injuries have the symptoms of depression. They do not feel depressed. Half of them will go to the doctor and say, I can't sleep. I don't have any energy. I'm not depressed. Come on, admit it. You're depressed. 80% of Americans who are depressed don't have depression. Primarily, it's a response to stress. Antidepressants, how do you find out if a medicine's an antidepressant? You give it to a rat, throw it in a bucket of water, and see how long it swims. Now, is that really a model for depression? No, it's a model for how to manage stress. Given our lifestyle creates the feelings of depression. But distinguishing those two, because these individuals will have physical depression. They may well have psychological depression for a lot of other reasons as well. But I like to distinguish those, especially because then the treatment is different if you have one or the other. Psychosis happens, on average, long after the injury. Average age of onset, time of onset from the injury to the psychosis is, unless you really know it, you won't know, 7 years. It takes 7 years to get psychotic after you have the injury. My belief is because that temporal lobe has been firing off so long the brain can no longer withstand it. Violence. Violence is a sign and symptom. Intermittent explosive time, from what I've talked about. Where is it injured? What kind of damage is going to create that? Intermittent explosive. Boom. Temporal lobe, we talked about that sudden burst and release. Disinhibition syndrome, I'm violent because I just can't stop myself from hitting. Damage area, a cortical separation, DAI, diffuse axonal injury. Misinterpretation of cues. A nurse walks in the room swinging a catheter, and I get very frightened. Different if he or she says, I'm coming in to catheterize you, Mr. Smith. That's paranoia. How many people have been paranoid? This is irrational fear. One person's been paranoid. Who else? You've been paranoid. A lot of you don't know what I mean by paranoid. Have any of you ever been driving and see a police car in the rearview mirror? What did your limbic system do with that? Instantaneous, not thinking. I'm not talking about your cortex. If your brain's intact, that goes up to the cortex, and what does the cortex do? Check your seatbelt, look at the speed limit. Okay, if I can calm down. But remember, the amygdala is still firing off, and by the way, once it fires, it takes 3 hours to settle down. So now what I'm going to do, drive a little extra tense. If I might just pull off and turn right. Now the police car turns right behind me. Okay, a new burst, and when he pulls in the driveway behind me, then it may not be psychosis anymore. Partly I say that because what soldiers have, what these injuries cause, these are things that are common to man, and they are not unique to them. We have the same kinds of things, it's just a lot more mild. I have a mild form. My son gave me a gift when he was 17 on Father's Day. He gave me the gift of a bungee jump. I was up on this thing, they were using a crane to do it, and I was there, and the chain, heavy chain, suddenly pulled off, and my feet were jerked. Sudden fear, instantaneous fear. About an hour and a half later, I got jeered enough that I went ahead and jumped. But I cannot look at an ad of these guys bicycling on the middle of a peak we see on TV without my limbic system firing off. Instantaneously it occurs, but it creates that. Do I have PTSD? No. Is my brain changed the same way PTSD is? Yes. Absolutely. Pretty minor thing, being asked to, by the way, 3 days later, a man was killed dropping off that, but I won't push that. The amygdala, I think I've used that word before. The amygdala is the primary mediator of fear. It's here. White matter, gray matter. White matter. Part of the brain thinking? Religion, sex, and politics. There's no logic here. What is all this laughter, Mark? You'll have to talk. Okay, here's the positive stuff. Things that warm fuzzies. Where is that? Ventromedial prefrontal cortex. That's the thinking. That's conscious. We are consciously aware that we feel good. We can do something about that. We can't do anything about the other except what Dr. Ross wants us to do and get these two talking to each other. Have this one override this. Again, brain injury, it's a different factor. Nothing's absolute, but it really impacts the ability for the cortex, the positive feelings about who I am, I'm a good person, all that kind of thing, to impact the bad stuff. And time-wise, am I down to? You're doing pretty good. You got about a half hour left. Oh, half an hour left. Okay, I was thinking it might be more like 25 minutes. Because I had 40 minutes to start with. I like to have this kind of thought go in my mind. I do this kind of thing sometimes walking into a patient, the office. Even if I'm running late, I will often stop myself for 10 seconds and talk to myself and prepare my heart, my limbic system, to be fully present to that individual. By the way, I use red lights the same way. Red light means the universe wants me to take a breath, reorient myself. Some other people, and without that technique, I have other feelings about the red light. That's what Dr. Ross wants you to do, cognitive override of the meaning of that experience. The fish with a hook in its mouth looks crazy to the other fish who don't see the hook. That's the piece that is missed. It's missed in the psychological issues like Dr. Ross. It's present here. It's in that way a silent injury. The fish looks fine, except that fish is not swimming along in the school with the rest of us. Get with it, fish. Start swimming with the rest of us. What are the conditions around the PTSD part? And this is more from a medical perspective. It doesn't mean that either of the presentations are right or wrong. It means that this is coming from a different perspective. First is what he's mentioned, what I also talked about. These are things that can induce symptoms that can be in the cluster of PTSD without being PTSD, or PTS now to get away from the D part of it. Let's drop the full syndrome. Let's look at the ways in which this person's been injured. 100%. That's where those numbers come from. 100% of individuals have had things in their life during the war that have impacted how that amygdala works. That fear center of the brain is activated in a way it wasn't before. By the way, the activation can be measured with the newer X-ray techniques, and you can see it, and it runs hot. It runs hot with these individuals, even when it's not causing any symptoms to speak of. So all these lists, and by the way, I didn't put J down here, which is bungee jumping. But I mentioned that again just to give you the idea. I mean, go ahead and laugh at me. You've been all that. But how mild is that compared with these things? And yet it has changed my brain permanently. Triggers. What sets off these things? Environmental things. I mentioned the thalamus before. The thalamus puts valence on the things and decides what to do with them. Signal comes in, the thalamus decides. Be perfectly straight. These are adults here. Sexual orgasm comes from the genitals and fires up to the brain. What source of nerve fibers carry the feeling of orgasm? Pain. Orgasm is pure pain. It goes to the thalamus. The thalamus decides, is this rape and therefore it is pain, or is this a loving experience and gives me the greatest joy it can be? The signal going into the brain is exactly the same nerves, same everything, but the experience is decided by the thalamus. Now, the thalamus is damaged. How successful is it going to be at deciding which it is, especially deciding clearly? It may decide both things, and we call that ambivalence. It's not going to be able to do that. There's one part of the brain, of the signals that does not go through the thalamus, and that's smells. The emotional reaction to smells will be always the same, and a lot in common. But a lot of us, one smell will be negative. And by the way, in terms of treatment, being around a smell that is positive to the brain will positively impact the rest of the brain. And you know, therapists, massage people, such do put odors into their room, odors that have a natural calming effect. And that's what can be very helpful to individuals who have this kind of activation that we're talking about. Now we're talking about complications. Substance abuse, big one, for whatever reasons. It was there before. Military sometimes encourages drinking. It treats symptoms, all these symptoms we talked about. Ethanol helps, right? What happens when the ethanol disappears? The symptoms get worse. So then what's the best thing to do? More alcohol. Not really the best thing to do, but for the person who wants immediate relief, there is nothing much better. This is going to work better than any prescription kinds of things. All of the psychiatric illnesses can come in there, and separating that illness from the inducer of the illness, that the problem is the brain change from the blast injury, but it's now coming as a complication. Relationship problems. A couple years ago, I was invited by the Iraqi government to come over there because this is an area of specialty for me. And the complaints they had, they were asking me to come because of, and this is going to blow you away, it did me, domestic violence. Soldiers were returning home and they were abusing their wives. And my model of what happens in these cultures is that husbands are allowed to do that. It's no big deal. But for the government to say, no, this is a big deal and we want to make a difference. Obviously, divorce rate is high. Men divorce their wives much more often than the other way around. But even if you're not divorced, it puts huge stress. And obviously, unemployment comes in. The feeling of I'm incompetent, that's more the psychological stuff. It gets activated here. These are the kinds of things that Dr. Ross was talking about. Now, classic specific symptoms include flashbacks. Flashbacks is when that amygdala gets activated, something happens in the environment, and that sets off the amygdala to start firing. It heats up, and suddenly it sends intense signals out of fear, rage, anger, instantaneously. This is not a count to 10 situation. This fires off. Now, the cortex is supposed to count to 10, but why doesn't it? It's not connected anymore. Or it's very little connected. And again, I don't want to talk absolute. It's not like there's no connection, but there's not full connection. So the ability to count to 10 is decreased. That thinking is not going to work. So what can you do that might not involve that? And I'm not a therapist, and so this may be inappropriate, but this is the kinds of things I talk with my patients. Just learn to get out of there. Leave the environment. Mothers do that. When do mothers get their children out of the environment? When their limbic system is firing off and that amygdala is firing and the frontal lobe doesn't know enough, isn't developed enough to stop it. By the way, the frontal lobe kicks in around age 12. There is no 10-year-old that doesn't have ADHD. It may not show. But by adult standards, that brain is not mature. That's another talk, sorry. What mother says, go to get out of the environment. It's very healthy. The mother may think she's punishing, but it actually is very therapeutic. The tone of voice may make it a punishment. But the getting out of the environment is exactly the right thing to do. Just plain breathing. Letting extra oxygen to the brain, let that heal. Breathing itself is a calming influence. So just plain breathing. Do not run away. Do not fight. This is setting off a chemical in the body called adrenaline. Adrenaline wants fight or flight. We don't give into it. We hold back from that behavior. With some patients, I had one recently, couldn't stop himself. When you feel that hit, look at your watch or count to 5. Give it 5 seconds, and then do everything you want to do, but give it 5 seconds. The everything is what we had described from Dr. Ross. Perimeter checks, check out who's there, get a weapon, and by the way, there are whole countries that build walls between themselves and other countries, but we won't go there either. Islands of health. In that situation, you can see nothing good in the future. You see nothing good around you. You see nothing good in yourself. The only positive resource that's left are islands of health from the past, positive memories from the past. That's all you got. What can you do? Put some pictures up of times when you were happy as a child. You look at that picture, you immediately allow that to get reactivated because that's the only thing that's going to reactivate. That goes to that prefrontal cortex. It also impacts the limbic system. So that can be a way to connect on positive. We call them islands of health. In the past, those of you who know the Psalms, when King David was having his panic attack, he said, I will remember what you did in the past and I will have hope. Well, that's the next talk, by the way. But that's the thing an individual can do, and I recommend pictures to make that happen. If you're kind of partly through therapy, even writing it down, because when you're not having a panic attack, you won't remember what it was like. It's a different state, but that's where you can write down what it was like. Occasionally, if it's serious violence, I recommend families videotape, because then the individual can watch the videotape and they can see. Especially that's true when there's alcohol problems as well. The individual afterwards, the amygdala was driving it, the cortex wasn't. Watching the video is the cortex talking to you. Dual diagnosis, we've talked about that a bit. This is the thing that I want to emphasize. Neuropsychological testing are those tests to find out what's really wrong with the brain. They also have components that says, is the person faking? Are they showing effort? If you have dual diagnosis, half the time you will not show effort, even though you're putting effort. Those tests miss that. PTSD will not show it. PTSD will show that you're putting effort in. Alcoholism will show that you're putting effort in. When you've got both, that doesn't happen half the time. This is going to put another bias in that this person isn't trying. Be aware that when they're both diagnoses, because that's not common knowledge. People see the test and, oh, okay, the test says they're not trying. Want to look at the neurotransmitters? Now we're talking the chemicals, and you've heard that. Anybody hear the term chemical imbalance? Okay, well, you just haven't been listening to things very well. Do we need to use that tap test again? What kind of time we've got here? Are we down to 25 minutes yet?
20 minutes for the presentation, maybe 15 and then 5 for questions.
Okay, so 20 minutes more that I can... Okay, so we have some time with this. By the way, neurotransmitters are not in your body. When I eat a sandwich for lunch, is that in my body? At one level it is. If I cut open my stomach, there it'll be. Is it in my body? No. It's got to get absorbed into the body. Then it joins the body. Neurotransmitters are all outside the body. They're not in the cells. One cell released it, it's on its way to another cell, it's not in the body. Most of our treatments in psychiatry treat neurotransmitters. When we do, we are not treating the illness. We're putting chemical changes that are induced by the way we alter the neurotransmitters. What's the problem with this kind of injury? The entire brain is not affected. These cells aren't working well, but there are other cells in the brain that are working just well, and we're going to change them too. It's heavy-footed. It's like government rules. When the government makes a law, it's trying to help with something, but it's heavy-footed. It does not take into account individual cases. And that's the problem with treatments that impact the whole brain. Again, functional, like Dr. Ross was talking about, much more often. It is the whole brain, and it's more a valid way to treat. But otherwise, with this kind of injury, blast injuries and the other traumatic brain injuries, it's always uneven. By the way, that's probably a new concept. Doesn't make any sense. The neurotransmitters, and these are them, are not inside the body. They are produced by the body, but they leave the body and go back into the body at another spot. When we try and address those, we're addressing the downhill. If I've got pneumonia and I take aspirin, what does it do? It gets rid of the fever. What does it do for the pneumonia? Absolutely nothing. In fact, it makes it worse because fever is the natural antibiotic for the body, but that's a whole different thing. So if we are treating neurotransmitters, we are not treating disease. Where is the disease? Inside the cell. What kind of damage has happened to the cell? 2 damages? Let's do that tapping test. Remember the rules? If I tap once, you tap. If I tap twice, you don't do anything. Got something hard so I can hear whether you're doing it? Now what's happening? A lot of range there. People are tapping right away. Some aren't tapping for 2 hours later. Let's get right on the ball here. Okay, that's better. Okay, now what happened? A number of taps before I even hit. Your limbic said, I wanted to hit. Your frontal lobe didn't have a chance to say, do I hit or don't I? So you had activation of your amygdala that your frontal lobe could not suppress. The frontal lobe is tired. Trust me. You've been hearing boring lectures. Well, you had a big lunch. What is this? Is this Friday? I don't know who designed this practice, and I don't know who put me on after lunch, but I have to talk to them. Because that's going to cut down my ability to get information through to you. By the way, if I do use humor successfully, what part of the brain does that activate? Not the cortex, not logic. It activates your subcortical system, activates you, activates the emotion. And so it'll be much more successful at having impact, unless it offends you. This is what the different ones do. Those of you who watch TV have heard about serotonin. Problem with serotonin connected to depression. By the way, that number 2 is actually part of serotonin. It gives you relatedness to other people. You feel connected. If I come back to King David again, when he was depressed, the heavens were as brass. He had no connection. He couldn't feel that connection because the cells in his brain weren't making adequate amount of serotonin. Norepinephrine just plain wakes you up. This is impacted by some chemical that some of you had today. Anybody use drugs today? Yeah, you were sort of forced to. They didn't have a lot of drug-free drinks out there. By the way, what's stronger than norepinephrine for stimulation? Ritalin. What's stronger than that? Adderall. What's stronger than that? Yep. And going all the way to methamphetamine and then all the way to cocaine. It's degrees. It's really the same thing, but it's just how intensely it does it. Now, dopamine, that's the pleasure one. That's the one you want. All addictions fire off dopamine. It gives you pleasure. It gives you reward. Obviously, then addictions. It gives you drive, energy to do something, enthusiasm to get something done, to engage. And that comes from, oh goodness, I put it right here, thalamus. Are we going to do that test again? The thalamus does that. And what about the thalamus in blast injury? Cytoskeletal architectural damage. It's damaged internally from the overpressure of the blast. So it is not going to make as much dopamine. Your brain is not going to have as much ability to enjoy pleasure. So what are you going to do? Maybe you'll try and get more of it. Get the addiction to push whatever possible amount of dopamine the brain will make, because the brain wants to have a feeling of enthusiasm and energy to do those kind of things. But it's a positive feedback loop. Glutamate, glutamic acid, is the neurotransmitter that damages the brain. When does the brain need damage? Well, your brain fills your skull and you want to learn algebra. Literally, the algebra part of the brain will get bigger, right parietal lobe. Your brain can't fill your skull, and we can't give you surgery to make your skull bigger. So what does glutamic acid have to do? It has to go around and find the parts of the brain that aren't being used and trim them off. So I've got to forget hopscotch or something like that if I'm going to want to learn this. That's the purpose of this acid. By the way, when there's brain damage, the brain no longer fills the skull. You don't need as much glutamic acid. What does stress do? Stress raises the amount of glutamic acid. Broadly speaking, it's what fires off in the old-fashioned way with a saber-toothed tiger. You don't need a committee meeting to decide what to do. You don't even need to count to 10. Your limbic system is firing off, and you don't want a committee meeting. You want to be either running or attacking before you've had a chance to think about it. There's another acid in the brain called in the brain in the body called peptic acid. Anybody heard of that? Okay. When I was starting treatment as a physician back in the 50s, what was the treatment? The treatment was in the hospital, if you were making too much acid, with a bottle of half and half, and you were supposed to drink half and half every half hour. What does half and half do for the acid in your stomach that's too much because you're under stress and cause an ulcer? It's a base. It treats the acid. The acid goes down. But with milk products of all kinds, 45 minutes later, it raises the acid because the brain says, hey, I got to get some more acid in here. This isn't treating. So when we were treating people with milk or cream for ulcers, we were making it worse. It was an older treatment, by the way, that doctors used called phlebotomy, where we take your blood away, and we don't have any blood. Suddenly that does activate you, but it has some negative effect. I'm told that's what George Washington died of, and it may have been an assassination, but that's what the doctors were doing in those days. GABA aminobutyric acid, otherwise known as GABA, is calm. What activates GABA aminobutyric acid in the brain that you're all familiar with? We had caffeine up there under 3. Actually, it's number 2, but it's under 3 here. Alcohol. Alcohol induces GABA, but your brain makes its own gamma aminobutyric acid. Addictions essentially only come when you're giving the brain artificially what it makes itself. How many people's brains, and I'm talking about the function, not necessarily the actual chemical, how many people's brains here make alcohol? Every one of you. Alcohol, no drug of addiction does anything unless your brain makes it itself. Otherwise, the brain doesn't know what to do with it. The only way the brain knows what to do with alcohol is because it makes its own. But if we give an artificial amount from outside, then we're talking addictions, right? Because suddenly we have more of this that we like. By the way, for me, my first addiction, eyeglasses. Those of you who wear eyeglasses remember when you first put them on. It was gorgeous. You may remember how long till you needed the second pair of glasses because your eye got addicted to that, and therefore you had to boost the effect. That was my first addiction. I won't tell you my second one. Or maybe I will. Caffeine. But when you try and overshoot that, then it's calm. Now, based on that, how many people's brains make LSD? Absolutely. I sort of had to encourage you. Now, I don't have the police back there, so everybody's brain's making cocaine. You're making all these things, but it's controlled by the brain deciding how much. When you put an artificial amount in, that's when addictions kick in. Acetylcholine, that's what gives you memory. Semantic memory. Cortex, that's what makes the cortex remember things. By semantic would mean words. Content where we can talk about what happens. This is what deteriorates with Alzheimer's. This by itself is not as impacted by it, but there are medications that are called anticholinergics, medicines that drop the normal amount of acetylcholine down and therefore produce a mild form of Alzheimer's, a mild form of low memory problem. How many people remember the ad? Fisherman out on the boat. This guy had a cold, he took a cold medicine, and therefore he was out of it. We couldn't trust him to drive the boat right or sail it. Cold medicines, almost all of them, are anticholinergic. They will make your memory deteriorate. You will not be able to remember as well. And that's the most common medication. A lot of prescription medicines do the same thing, and that's something you need to pay attention to. The specific way to tell is dry mouth and sometimes constipation. But any medicine that gives you dry mouth and constipation is a medicine that is anticholinergic, and your memory will not be as good for things that involve words. So what do we want to do in terms of treatment? Well, treatment number one, this is critical, and this is where I go with patients, and this is a commitment I need to hear them make. Function takes precedence over symptom control. This is going to feel cruel, but I don't care if you're having panic attacks. I want you out there walking dogs. I want you doing something to get your life back, and we don't care about the symptoms. We'll try and work with the symptoms, but PTSD, in many ways, I compare with cancer. Untreated PTSD will grow, control more of you. More and more of your life will be destroyed by the symptoms of PTSD. So, restoration of function takes precedence. What do I run into? Benzodiazepines and benzodiazepine equivalent. There's something that's, I call it powdered alcohol. Works the same way as alcohol. Know any names? Klonopin, Ativan, Xanax, Valium, absolutely. You know these. That's powdered alcohol. And the difficulty with that is you're concerning about symptom control and not restoration of function. The other one is narcotics. And basically, when I'm going to be working with you, since I'm in a rehab model, that needs to be a commitment. Commitment to get off narcotics, commitment to get off benzodiazepines. If that's not something that you are able to do, then it's a hospice model. Then comfort is your thing. I'm not talking about hospice with a capital H. But hospital with a capital H is, we're not trying to treat your cancer. We're not trying to get well. We've given up on that. Your cancer's already got you. We want you to die in peace, comfort. When you use those medications, when an individual uses those medications, it's a vote toward having their peace rather than wellness. This is not absolute. I'm not talking black and white, and I'm certainly not talking about a sudden change. We're talking maybe 6 months to a year to make that happen. But the commitment to do it counts for a lot. It counts more than the actual change. My commitment to say, I want my life back, and I don't care as much that I hurt. I don't care as much that I'm having flashbacks as I care about getting my life back. I am going to get out, and some of the therapies actually focus on that same thing. Get function back, get your life back. Quickest question for that, is your world getting bigger? If your world's getting bigger, broadly speaking, you're on the road to health. And if you're on the road to health, that's okay from my perspective. Very simple, quick and dirty question. Quick and dirty question. Regulate sleep-wake cycle. What happens to the sleep-wake cycle with brain injuries? What happens to the wake part? What happens to the wakefulness part of the day?
Drink.
Yeah, absolutely. You're not as awake day. In fact, you run out of brain before you run out of day. It's called nerve fatigue, and you're going to be whooped by 4 or 5 in the afternoon. Absolutely. You may still function, but you are not going to be fully awake. What happens at night? Right. You don't sleep as deeply. Sleep is restless. How do you know about that? You wake up not feeling rested. And at one level, I don't really care whether you think you slept or not. I care where you wake up refreshed. If you wake up refreshed, your body's had enough sleep. People being able to guesstimate how well their sleep is, they almost always are off on that. And usually, they give a much higher number. What we measure with formal studies, they're sleeping longer. If you wake up refreshed, is your world getting bigger? Are you waking refreshed? If you're doing those things, you've got the core of wellness. So how are you going to treat a sleep problem with brain injury? Counterintuitive, you're going to give stimulants in the morning. Because if the brain is awake during the daytime, it will sleep naturally. There's no sleeping pill that's not addictive. We're forcing the brain down by giving it chemicals. It will get immune to those chemicals. The same thing happens to some extent with stimulants in the morning. But if the brain's not making enough dopamine, not making enough norepinephrine, and you give it that artificially with medicine up to the point of normal, you are not going to get addicted. You only get addicted if you want to overshoot. You want to feel better than normal. The brain's going to fight that and bring that down to normal. These medications will make you feel that way. The physician gives you too high a dose. You think, hey, I need to do extra work today. I got an exam in school. I take an extra dose. Hey, I really feel good. Easy then to go for that same thing again. So that's the careful thing, because when we're talking stimulants, caffeine, what's the problem with caffeine, by the way? You may not know. It's length of action. How long does caffeine have impact on wakefulness? I have some caffeine. How long till I get as deep a sleep as normal? 3 nights. Those of you who stop caffeine know when the caffeine withdrawal symptoms kick in. 3rd day. That's when the caffeine gets out of your system. Drinking in the morning, that helps because then there's not as high amount, but by evening it's still there. You already don't sleep well because you've had a brain injury. What's going to happen with caffeine? It's going to make a difference. If my brain is healthy, I can probably put some caffeine into it, and no big deal, because instead of sleeping super deep, I'm sleeping deep. Perfectly okay. And by the way, in that kind of situation, caffeine is not actually bad. I own a small coffee kiosk. By the way, it's an alternative medicine, and it's in the Whitney Center, where all alternative medicines are used. But it's not appropriate for our patients with brain injuries, because it's going to have that negative effect on sleep.
5 minutes.
Oh, boy, that went fast. Okay, I need to be awake for the next 5 minutes. Modafinil, you also probably don't know about. This promotes wakefulness. It's not a stimulant, but it allows you to be awake when you're interested. You can also take a nap if you're interested. Biochemically, it's exactly the reverse of date rape medicine, where you're awake and you're very passive. This is awake and active. Not a stimulant. It is absolutely the best way to go. It's difficult for insurance to pay sometimes, but that's not going to cause an addiction. It can be desired. They practice this on Haight-Ashbury, where they give individuals their various, and they can say this is addictive. How much would you give for it? And with modafinil, a nickel. By the way, Ritalin gets $10. Stimulants, again, that same idea, getting out of the system in time so that the person can sleep well. Avoid the benzodiazepines, because they are powdered alcohol. And alcohol is not a good treatment, because withdrawals create their own problems. Narcotics we've already mentioned, the anticholinergic medications we've mentioned, and the older medicines for psychosis can be problematic. So what do you use? You don't want to change neurotransmitters, because that's not the problem. You want to make the cells happy, because the cells are damaged. How can you make the cells happy? Omega-3 fatty acids. And where do we find omega-3 fatty acids? Fish. Those of you who are religious, after you're dead, in resurrection, what are you going to eat? We only know one person that was resurrected. And what did he eat? Fish. So start enjoying it here. Vitamin D3 in Michigan, Western Michigan, normal vitamin D essentially doesn't exist. We don't have enough sun. You have to take artificial vitamin D. The lab's results for vitamin D are low. How do you decide what a normal amount of vitamin D is? You don't know this, but you check the level on 100 people, and whatever their level is, we're calling that normal. But what if everybody runs 20% low? Then what we're calling normal is not normal. So you, as well as the patients you work with, need vitamin D. By the way, you also need omega-3s. By the way, I blame that on Henry Ford. Henry Ford gave us cars, and so we didn't have to live by the water and didn't have to eat all that free food. The anti-epileptic medicine, what is epilepsy? Electrical firing off, the cell walls letting electricity fly out. That affects the motor, a different part of the brain, because it's the part of the brain that we treat, which is what part of the brain that starts firing off electrically? It's Specifically, yes, the temporal lobe, because we talked about temporal lobe activation. So medicine for epilepsy will stabilize the nerve. The wall of the nerve is anti-epileptic medicine. The insulation on the nerve is omega-3. So the fat is insulation. We want to make that strong, and we want to make the wall strong. GABA-aminobutyric acid enhances the brain making its own GABA. The brain makes its own alcohol, shall we say. Can't get addicted to it. Memantine impacts that acid that we talked about. Too much glutamic acid calms it down. Interestingly, it's approved for one illness, which is Alzheimer's disease, because that's where memory impacts. Lamotrigine or Lamictal does the same thing. There are only two medicines that do that. Lamotrigine is also an anti-epileptic medicine, so you can treat epilepsy and improve memory. The gamma-aminobutyric acid treats the anxiety component. By the way, you may have seen ads for that called Lyrica. Amantadine directly gives you dopamine, activates dopamine, and so that's that one that'll make you feel good without addicting you. If you push it, you can get some addiction. But amantadine is a wonderful, by the way, as you activate it, you see more of the environment and you read the environment. You read the environment emotionally. Now the environment, if you're reading it emotionally, may be wonderful. It may be scary. It may be paranoid. So I may be awake, emotionally attend to the environment, and have the environment scary. During the Cold War, all of the proletariat were on amantadine. Scared the heck out of me. Questions? And I'll make up some answer.
We've got time for just a couple.
Yes?
If you say drugs, whatever, if you're increasing heroin, you're taking in heroin, you're adding to what your body actually produces, are your cells going to increase or decrease receptors?
What's the guess? Your brain makes heroin. You give it artificial amounts of heroin. What's it going to do? Yes, make less heroin. So now you stop heroin, and what's your heroin level in your body? Less than normal. You have actually taken a low heroin level and made it worse.
Does it deal with the receptors at all, or just the production?
Oh, yeah, but the production then affects the receptors. The production goes down, therefore the receptors don't get as much heroin, so then the effect is down. So yes, neurotransmitter, the heroin is low, but the cause is inside the cells, because that's where the heroin worked, to induce the body to make more heroin. That's why you get addicted to eyeglasses, because the eye doesn't have to work as hard anymore. But whenever you give by the way, in terms of treatment, if you do something for them, for one of these, if someone does something for you that you can do for yourself, what happens to you? Yes, you get doing less of it. How do you feel about that? You feel guilty, because you know you could have done it. But do you keep doing it? At least if you're me? Absolutely, because it feels so good. But yes, that's the difficulty with doing. And when I work with families, it is rare to find a family that appropriately balances the two. They can identify, give one more second. They can identify when the person needs help. Question. 5-year-old says, tie my shoes. Do you tie them? Yes, you tie them? How many people, yes, they tie them? How many people don't tie them? Okay. How many people have to be intuitive mothers that decide at that moment, can this child tie his shoes? If the child can tie them, but you do it for him, he'll end up in prison because he'll be a sociopath. If you don't tie them when he can't, he'll end up wetting his bed and be neurotic. So at least there's choices. Now the data shows you got to get it right 70% of the time. If you get it right 70% of the time, your kid's going to turn out just fine.
Last question right over here.
You mentioned dual diagnoses between
Yes.
PTSD and alcoholism. Are there any other dual diagnoses like PTSD and MDD that you would point out as being common or more prevalent than normal?
Of course, I noted that any diagnosis is, you're saying FTD, frontotemporal dementia? Manic depressive?
Military.
Major depressive. Yes, absolutely. Partly because we already know the cells coming out of the limbic system are damaged. All of the cell bodies that make serotonin are there. So your brain does not get a normal amount of serotonin. So you're going to have the physical symptoms of depression. You're also going to have psychological symptoms of depression because you don't have a life. I mean, one of the things I run into is, high school, I got friends. Go to the military, I come back, my friends have jobs. They're working. They got families. Where am I?
Behind. You're behind.
Exactly. Big time behind. Even if I have an older brother who's smarter than I, when I come through school, the teacher said, "Why aren't you like your older brother?" And I, of course, my answer was, I don't care, because as a child, you do not want to say you're defective. You want to say you don't care. Kids that say they don't care to do math, most of the time they can't do math. It's very hard to admit that you are defective. It's easy to admit you're lazy. Trust me. So that's probably...
This guy is not lazy. Thank you very much, Ted.
It's my distinct honor to be able to introduce Chaplain Herman Kaiser, Jr. today. Chaplain Kaiser retired in 2002 after serving for 34 years as an Army chaplain. And I'll tell you, he works harder in retirement than I work at my real job, and I work pretty hard. This man is phenomenal. He served in both Vietnam and Hawaii. After that, he was on the staff of senior officers and officials in the Department of the Army and the Department of Defense. Furthermore, he served as the command chaplain for the European Command. For hundreds of years, societies have known their soldiers risk life and limb. It is only recently we have begun to understand that they also risk their neurological health, their mental health, and their souls. They receive little or no compensation, recognition, or help in dealing with these risks. Chaplain Kaiser, early in his career in the jungles of Vietnam, realized that his men were taking much more risk than just physical injuries. For many years, he's been a tireless advocate for a deeper understanding and more help for these hidden wounds of war. He is not only a remarkable man, but also one of the finest clinicians I've ever had a chance to work with. Please join me in welcoming Chaplain Kaiser.
It's like being back in the Pentagon. When you're a colonel, you're the last one to leave. And usually after you make the first pot of coffee. My email address got messed up in here. It's kaiserh@msn.com. Going to talk about moral injury, look at some of the definitions and causes, and then recovery from moral injury after war, and then some important congregational and community issues in soul repair. And one of the reasons why we worked on congregations is because the whole reason I got started in this business after I retired from the Christian Reformed Church was we did a commission, truth commission on conscience and war. And we had about 85 commissioners that met together first in Riverside, New York, and then after a year of back and forth on computers and so forth, we came up with a report. And that report had two things that were really moral problems in relationship to modern war. And one was selective conscientious objection. The conscientious objection that is on the policy for the Department of Defense is that you have to be a pacifist in order to be classified as a selective conscientious objector or as a conscientious objector. And when I was first in Vietnam, I had a senior non-commissioned officer who had on his third year in Vietnam, and he had 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star. And he came back after he had a course in moral injury, course in world just war theory, and he came back and he said, I can no longer fight in this kind of war because we're not fighting to win. And we're fighting for a kind of stalemate. And I said, well, you know, you're not going to be able to get conscientious objector status for that. You have to be against all wars. And this is the 3rd time you're here, so it's pretty hard for you to say, I'm against all wars. And he said, I'd like to write it up anyway. So we wrote it up. It went to the Pentagon turned it down. He came back to Vietnam, and he was told to pick up his weapon and go fight. And he says, no, I'm not going to do that. They gave him a court-martial, and he was put in jail. And he was put in jail because most of his arguments were really about the legality and the morals of the war, and nothing about his objection to all wars. After that, I had 2 young soldiers who did the same thing. One of them decided to go to jail. The other one said, no, I'm not going to go to jail. I'll just stay here, and if I have to shoot, I'll think about shooting then. And he was out in the field, and 2 of his friends were killed because he did not take the opportunity to shoot the person who was shooting at them. And he became a moral basket case. And in Vietnam, we really began fighting asymmetrical war, and that's a war against people who don't follow the rules. And I was riding in the second deuce and a half behind another deuce and a half that was loaded with soldiers, and a young girl came running up alongside of the deuce and a half and threw a fragmentation grenade in, and as it exploded, the guy who was riding shotgun in our vehicle shot her and blew her head off. And as we passed through, he started to cry and sob, and he says, Chaplain, I have an 11-year-old daughter. And so he spent the rest of that night crying in my arms. And that's the problems of moral injury in war, and that's really what awakened me to this. As a result of the Truth Commission, they came up with 2 things. One was selective conscientious objection, and the other one was moral injury in war. Now, moral injury was just really coming to the forefront, and I'm glad you had a good psychiatric person talk about it before me, because I'll show you in the next slide that he's about right. But it's really an ancient wound of war. Jonathan Shea, who probably has written most of the good material early on PTSD, was a psychiatrist in Boston, and he worked for 20 years interviewing Vietnam vets, and he's written 2 books. One is Achilles in Vietnam, and that deals about all of the problems of morality of war, and the other one is Odysseus in America, and it took Odysseus 10 years to get home. And one of my young Marine captain friends says that war is not hell, war is the portal to hell. Coming home is hell. And I think that's part of the difficulty that we're seeing with moral injury. And so that throughout history there's been problems like that. But then in 2009, some people from the VA were struggling with the fact that they were healing people from PTSD only to have them raise very, very difficult religious and moral questions. PTSD, they were asking questions, why the heck can't I go to the mall without getting scared stiff? After they were cured about that and could go back to the mall, they would start asking questions, does God still love me in spite of what I did? How can I really kiss my wife after dirtying my hands with all kinds of human blood? And those are the kinds of questions that were being raised. So these people decided that they would put together a think piece, and the think piece was, is there such a thing as moral injury in war? And they suggested a 6 or 7 step protocol on trying to help people get over moral injury. And when Rita Brock and I looked at it, it looked so much like the early church's penance that we said, you know, maybe there's something religious in all of this, that even the clinicians begin to think so. Now, when the doctor was talking about the amygdala here and the center part of the brain, that's the part of the brain that really is a startle response. If I stand in front of you and slap my hand and you don't know I'm behind you, you go like this. You jump. And that kind of constant response goes on, and that's a more primitive part of the brain. It just will continue to respond and respond, and it never really rests. Now, if you're a soldier, you know that most of the time you're not going to rest. You're always alert and always aware of your environment and always aware of what's around you so that you can be able to know where the enemy is and so that you can be able to act when you see the enemy. The front part of the brain, the frontal cortex, is where your morals are, and where it really is the executive function of the brain. And one of the problems with soldiers is they don't sleep. You can go back and read from the psychiatric literature from World War I all the way through the present literature, and every one of the psychiatrists who works with the military says they got to do something more on sleep control because soldiers don't sleep. And sleep is really the food that keeps that frontal lobe going. And so what you have is a problem where when that amygdala gets so loaded up and the front part of your brain can't override any of that, then what happens is you're constantly in a different kind of state. And so PTSD really is a fear victim response, and it's a reaction to extreme conditions because of the damage done to that limbic brain. Whereas moral injury requires a healthy frontal cortex where empathy and moral thinking can occur. So one of the things that dawned on us is one of the places where people can come with all kinds of moral injury and hopefully be not judged and be helped are religious institutions. And I think the second place where people can come and not receive as much judgment but find community is at work. And so we started concentrating first on the whole business of trying to work with churches, and we got $650,000 from Lilly Foundation for 2 years to begin to look at how the religious communities can begin to help men and women coming back from combat who are experiencing moral injury. Now, PTSD comes from many kinds of exposure to trauma, and the doctor went over quite a bit of that already. Aspects of moral injury formation, it's participation in events that challenge the core beliefs or have no clear moral choices, including the violating of moral codes of training in a closed system. Now that's a big sentence. But the reality is the military is a closed moral system. And we are trained in the laws and morals of warfighting. And yet it's not the same kind of moral system that the moral system they have in the civilian community. So what they put everyone in the military through is a thing called basic training. And basic training is probably the most powerful experience of rite of passage that I have ever experienced. I was drafted in '62, and in those days I had hair, and I combed it back, and it looked like the south end of a duck flying north. And it was pink and gray days, and so I had pink and black on, and I really was spiffy when I walked into Fort Knox, Kentucky. And first place they brought us to was a barber shop, and the barber says, "How would you like it?" And I said, "Just to take a little off the sides." And he gave me the first part, like the part I wear now. And then they give you uniforms, and they take your first name away. You become Kaiser. and no longer Herman Kaiser. And then everything you do is by the book. You do it all together as a unit. You get up together, you go to bed together, you take your showers together. All that stuff is so regimented that you don't have time to be the individual that you were, and so you become a soldier. I had 3 years of college when I got drafted, so I was an acting sergeant, and we were coming back from bivouac, and we had a terrible bivouac. There's 2 hills on Fort Knox, Kentucky. One is known as Agony, and the other one is known as Misery, and when you walk up them, you know that they were well named. And we had rain, and we were just stinky and did not look soldierly at all. But I had the troops in road march, and as we were going by, we saw a bus coming to the barber shop. And the guy said, "Call Cadence, Kaiser." So I put him out on road march and called Cadence. And when we got by the barber shop, I said, "An eye's right." And all of the guys went like this, their chest puffed out, and they were soldiers. And those guys over there were recruits. And that happened in 8 weeks. Powerful kind of thing that happens. But there's sometimes in war where you really don't have clear moral choices, even in ordinary combat. But in today's wars, you get things like a young man who was told to go on a rooftop, and if he saw anything suspicious, he should shoot it. So he goes on top of the rooftop, and he knows that his friends are going to try to defuse an IED, and he's looking around, and this man walks out of this apartment building, and he's got a cell phone in his hand. The man knows that he can detonate an IED with a cell phone, so he's suspicious. His friends are now 5 feet away from that IED, and the man starts dialing his cell phone. And he shoots and kills them. Then they found out that the IED could only be pressure detonated and could not have been detonated by the IED. And so the young man was very, very cheerful and very mournful, and he said, "I killed an innocent man." He was probably getting on the phone to call his wife to see what she wanted him to bring home for the market. His commander comes up and says, "No, everything you did was okay. You were suspicious, and I told you if you saw something suspicious to shoot it." He says, "Yeah, but everything you trained me to do was not to kill an innocent man, and I just killed an innocent man." Now, that's where you begin to have moral conversations with some of the young men coming back from war. And it's use of personal agency that violates these core moral beliefs. And part of the problem with the current wars we've had is our government has not owned any of them. And the Constitution of the United States says that Congress should declare war because that gives us legitimacy as citizens to go and take up the arms and to kill an enemy. But we're doing that as agents, moral agents of the state. When you're with these kind of wars and you got secretaries and presidents saying these wars ain't worth a crap, then who owns the killing? It's the individual soldier who really becomes a personal agent for violating and doing the violent things of war. And then there's a reflection on the kind of memories that happen and some of the extreme conditions of extremity. And in Vietnam, I went 30-some days eating sea rations and without a shower. And my congregation started sitting down upwind, and so then you know you're in pretty bad shape. And those are the kinds of conditions that I had never lived in before, but those are the kind of conditions that happened, and you begin to remember those. Then there's an agony of judging oneself, because there's no one outside who can make moral sense out of what you did and explain it to you so that it makes moral sense to you. And then feelings of anger, grief, despair, and all that kind of stuff. And what's interesting for me is the fellows who served with me in Vietnam felt much more guilt. We had an enemy that we couldn't really always recognize. We were pretty well trained, but not that well trained. We knew that the tactics that were being held were not very good, but so we felt guilty about some of that stuff. But the soldiers coming back from these wars feel shame. And shame is much more difficult of an experience than guilt. Because guilt is over against some kind of thing or law out there or some kind of rule. But shame really says, I am crap. And that's what some of these young people are saying about themselves. They see so many things that make them see themselves as no longer being able to participate in society in any kind of moral way. And so you get a collapse of moral identity and the meaning system that supports it. And I know a lot of young soldiers who come back and they're greeted now at the airport by saying, thanks for your service. And many of them hate it. Because what the hell do you know about what service I did? Only 1% of the United States is involved in these wars. So how can you say, thanks for your service? What's much different than the way the guys came home from World War II. They came home on ships. And for 2.5 weeks, they usually spent with other guys who had been in the same kind of battles with them, and they diffused one another by telling stories about people who really understood exactly what was going on with them and exactly what they had gone through and really could appreciate what their service was. PTSD disrupts relationships to the world when the world becomes unreliable. Moral injury disrupts our relationship with ourself when our inner moral cord is doubted. When we no longer can doubt what our conscience says to us is really what happens in moral injury. One of my professors at Calvin Seminary tutored me on the just war theory, and one of the things he said was, to sin against your conscience is to commit moral suicide. And he was a smart man, I believed him. And most of what I've seen with people who sin against their conscience is suddenly they can continue to repeat the sins that they've been doing, almost to the point where the sin just becomes boring. A lot of marriages where there's been adultery, people say, oh, there was some excitement at the beginning, but then the luster soon wore off, and I wish it wasn't going on anymore. But it still goes on, and they still continue to sin against their conscience. Now, the military culture fosters a kind of moral and ethical codes of conduct. In war, being violent and killing are normal, and troops expect and are prepared for violence and killing. And they're trained to do that. And we've gotten so good at our training that that also causes some problems. Even prescribed killing or violence may have some lasting impact. And most service members can assimilate what they see and do in war because they're very well trained for it. Those who are less trained for it don't. Some of the recent statistics I saw on suicide were that the vast majority of suicides were people who had experienced less than 2 years of combat. Some of the uniqueness of combat and traumatic stress is it involves extended periods of time with multiple deployments. Vietnam, the most that I heard about was a guy had 5 deployments. I've talked to a Marine who was on his 9th deployment. And recently in death notices, one of the young men was on his 12th. And what that does is it never gives your brain, your frontal part of your brain, a chance to overcome, and you become so hypervigilant that you become careless. And you become so hypervigilant and so morally distraught that you can't make sense out of what you're doing. But it does create a morally tight, closed universe so that activities considered immoral in other contexts are sanctioned and even celebrating within the rules of engagement. And that becomes very, very difficult. I don't know if you remember about a year ago, there were pictures in the paper of some young soldiers from the 82nd holding up bodies of some of the people that they had killed. And the Secretary of Defense came and said that was, we don't do that in America. And I wrote him a letter and I said, look, Mr. Secretary, your father probably showed off a tank because that was a weapon in your war. I said, 36 men in that unit were killed by people who strapped explosives around themselves and went in and not only killed themselves but killed the enemy. They weren't showing bodies, they were showing tanks. They were showing weapons of destruction. It requires an abrupt kind of transition from one closed system to the other, and that's the problem with coming home. And that's especially true of those of our soldiers who are in reserve component, because they come home not to another unit, but they come home to people who really don't understand what they've been through. I came home from Vietnam and was in Great Lakes Naval Hospital for about 5 months, but I was always around people who understood my story and who I could talk to about it. And I've had a long story. I stayed in 40 years. But some of the things that disrupt our moral intuition around war is now we have reflexive fire training. The first military historian was I forgot his last name. Anyway, Slam Marshall. And he looked at what was done in World War II, and he said only about 1/4 of the soldiers shot to kill. And he did some other research, and he kind of said that was true. And now there's a book on killing that has come out by a retired lieutenant colonel in the Army, and he says that killing is an unnatural thing for humans to do to other humans. And he shows how throughout history people chose less to kill than they did to protect their friends. That they would only kill more if they were protecting their buddies. I went to visit the Gettysburg, and in the bus, our guide was talking to me, and he was asking what I was doing, and I was telling him I was working on moral injury, and that I had just read this book on killing, and he says, you're absolutely right. We went back in our warehouse, and we found the weapon, and when we turned it upside down, there were 10 shots in the weapon. That soldier just got up, put another shot in, pounded it down, pretended he fired, put it back down. He says if he ever would have really fired that, he'd have blown everybody away because it was so clogged up. And so what soldiers do now is they fire reflexively. And they don't reflect really on what they do. And I don't know if any of you have seen that training where they walk down a street and all of a sudden a cat appears over there, somebody appears in a window over there, all of a sudden there's a guy on a roof with a weapon, and they have to just pick their targets very quickly and shoot. And that's kind of reflexive kind of firing that is really necessary to live on a battlefield. I used to ask the general officers in charge of training and doctrine command, do you really think that's right? And they say, our job is to keep and make soldiers the most viable on the battlefield. That's what our job is, to keep them as long as we can, and that's the training we do to do that. Then there's the dehumanizing of the enemy, and that happens in every war, but it becomes especially more dehumanizing when you don't see your enemy or recognize him as an enemy or can't tell him from an enemy. And then there's killing, survival guilt, and almost every soldier who comes back has survival guilt. I went out of a helicopter at 150 feet and broke both my arms really badly, and when I was flying out of Japan, I was just feeling guilty like crazy because I wanted to get back to my boys because they needed me. I said, I'm a better chaplain than some of the other guys who are over there, in all true humility. And so, that survivor guilt stays with you. And grief, and then the encountering handling of human remains. It really has become a major factor in some of these wars, especially because in Vietnam, the bodies weren't tore up too bad because they were mostly small arms. But when you deal with these kind of explosives and the kinds of IEDs that our soldiers are looking at, the bodies that they see are very, very mutilated. And there's a book, Colored Black, by a Marine captain who was a female who worked in graves registration for a long time, and she talks about how they had silhouettes of human bodies, and when they found the body parts, they would color the parts of the body they found in black, and the other parts would not be colored. And it's really a book about how you really get moral injury. And participation in torture and atrocities and betrayal by the enemies or by authorities. And that's the one that Jonathan Shea talks about. Jonathan Shea disagrees with Lintz and the other one because they make it too individual. He says the military is basically an organization that has structure, and what we feel is that we have been betrayed by our authorities. And that's just like Achilles. If you have ever read the Iliad, you know that at the very beginning of the book, he is betrayed by Agamemnon. And he spends all the rest of his time dealing with that whole betrayal. And then there's doubt and uncertainty about the goals or missions. And when a soldier doesn't know what his mission is, then he really has problems. My Marine friend used to ask himself, what in the world am I here for? And sending these soldiers out to go against these Afghans or Iranians. Am I here to help? I'm not really helping. All we're doing is destroying their homes and everything else. And so he got out of the Marine Corps. And he wrote some pretty fantastic books after that, too. And that's his name, Tyler Boudreau. And one of the books that he wrote was Packing Inferno, the Unmaking of a Marine. And Packing Inferno comes from Dante's book on the Inferno. And, for me to think about a Marine reading that kind of literature really surprised me, so I had to read his book. But the kinds of losses that a soldier comes back with are tremendous. When you start adding it all up, I mean, it really is a tremendous load of loss. Loss of some of your closest friends, and you don't make friends any closer than you do your buddies in combat. A sense of the unit and that closed system, there's something very unique about the military where you feel protected, you feel part of a society. We've been living here in Grand Rapids for 13 years since my retirement, and we still don't know half of our neighbors. When we move on a military installation, the neighbors would come and greet us with coffee and cakes and all that kind of stuff. And we had to find out where the stores were. In the military, you just say, where's the commissary? Or where's the PX? And your life is so much more ordered in that closed system that you don't have to worry about all this other stuff, like whether you're going to go to A&P or Meyer or whatever. Then loss of role and identity. Your role is very clear in the military, what you are. If you talk to anybody in the Air Force, they'll tell you what plane they fly, because that's what their identity is all built around. Loss of home, the relocation off base. So you're dealing with, all of a sudden you got to pay rent. You got to make sure the boiler's working. You just can't call the people from post to come and do that. You have financial losses, and this is especially true of people in the reserve component, who many of them are professionals, but who are in the reserve component or the National Guard as non-commissioned officers. So you go from a doctor's salary to a sergeant's salary, and that's a lot of loss of money. And loss of weapons. And I think this is one that we don't think about much. But from the day you go into the military till the day you leave, you've got a weapon. And you learn to take that thing apart in the dark. You learn to put it together in the dark. You learn how to clean it. You clean it every day because every morning the sergeant's going to inspect it. If you drop it while you're sitting in basic training, you have to sleep with it all night. And so when you're out in the field, that thing is right next to you, sometimes under your pillow. and all of a sudden you turn that thing in, and so you lose a real sense of security. And that's one of the reasons why most young soldiers go out and buy weapons after they get out. Then there's a loss of family and capacity for intimacy, discord and divorce that happens. Loss of community, of support, and that's yourself and your family, and loss of faith and meaning. And finally, the loss of reason to live. Now, recovering from moral identity after the war, one of the best things that people can do is write narratives. If you've got any family that's in the military right now, the best thing you could do is to advise them to write a diary and keep a diary so that they can put their thoughts and stuff down. And I had to go through learning how to tell my story about what it was like. And it's strange. I had a fairly decent career. And when I would say, oh, I work for General so-and-so, somebody would say, oh, yeah, Kaiser's bragging again. No, that's not the fact. I just worked for this guy who happened to have 4 stars, who happened to be on the way up. He was the vice chief of staff of the Army, and he'd call me up as a major to come and write speeches for him. And but in order for me to get that in, I had to learn to be able to live with that kind of stuff in a civilian society rather than in the military society. And then integrating memory and that story into the larger picture. Only part of your life is connected with the military. And you have to be able to take that whole military experience and put it in a larger narrative and a larger story of who you are. And then reconnect with estranged others, and that's very difficult. Most of the troops that come back who are suffering isolation from war, they self-medicate themselves or they go to the VA and the VA medicates them. If you want to read a good portion of what it was like to have PTSD, there's a book, Until Tuesday, and it's about a guy who gets a dog, and his dog is Tuesday. And you read the story about what his life was like before Tuesday came along, and you really get a great picture of what it was like to be under PTSD. He'd sneak out at night to buy his gin and all that kind of stuff. And then all of a sudden he gets his dog, and his dog had a rough life too, but the dog could intuit what he was saying better than any other person. And I'd like to have sometime a wife who could do that. And then long-term support and accountability within a community. One of the things that has happened as a result of serving in these wars is many of the young troops come back and they're looking for a benevolent moral authority. And part of that is because they can go talk to a chaplain, and the chaplain has privileged communication so that there's no court that can make the chaplain testify to anything that was said in privileged communication. It's probably the most strict of any laws around privilege between clergy and clients of anywhere else in the world that's in the military. So they can trust you. They come to me, they can unburden all kinds of stuff. They go to the mental health and they tell them a problem, and the mental health says, oh boy, you can't work with your security clearance the way you are, so we're going to take your security clearance away. So you lose your security clearance, then you lose your job, you lose who you are, and everything goes because you went to see that shrink and he's determined that you weren't able to do everything. Then a lot of them are looking for reparations and forgiveness. How in the world can I make up for what I've done? And how in the world can I be forgiven for what I've done? And they're looking to foster reconnection and looking for some long-term petting. I'm sorry? Now, I think that this dialogue between a benevolent moral authority is there's a practice, the importance of deep, non-judgmental listening to experiences that participate in moral injury. And that non-judgmental, I think, is very important because you're sitting there listening to a story that really happened, And you may not have done it the way that young soldier did, but you don't know either if you would have done it the way that young soldier did. And I think part of acknowledging positive regard for another human being is be able to listen to them non-judgmentally. And to offer benevolent understanding and moral struggle. And here's where I think, you know, people outside of the medical profession can be very helpful, because all this says is what people really need is to be befriended. They need a friend who they can talk to. They need somebody who would be willing to be there with them and listen to what they have to say and acknowledge the fact that they are in a moral struggle, and that's okay. One of the young men who I worked with, he says he was the first one to go to jail for not going back to war. And he said, do I regret what I did? He says, yeah, I regret what I did. Do I want to forget it? No, I don't want to forget it. I said, why don't you want to forget it? He says, because if I forget it, then I'm less than a human being. What I have to do is learn to remember it, and to remember it without judging myself and condemning myself for it. And then to offer firm core moral beliefs that emerge. And, you know, those are very simple things in some ways. A man called me up and asked me, you know, some advice for his son. His VA psychiatrist had advised him to go to the mall, and he was deathly afraid of crowds. And so I said, okay, I'll take him to the mall. So before we went into the mall, I said, look, as soon as you feel a little anxious, you let me know, and we're out of here. And so I did that for 3 weeks. And finally, he said, Chaplain Kaiser, I don't need you anymore. And that's the first person who said that to me that I really was glad he did. Because he really did. He had gotten out, and he now saw that the mall in Grand Rapids, Michigan was very, very different than the marketplace in Afghanistan. And to discuss how reparative might occur in the current context. And if you look at who goes on some of these places where there have been hurricanes and tragedies, you'll find that a big percentage of the ones that volunteer to go on those are military people. Because that's one way they can make reparation. And then to offer support for self-forgiveness and forgiveness of others. And theologically, I have a problem with self-forgiveness. I don't know what that is. But I think I have to forgive myself in order to feel forgiven. But I also know that St. Augustine says that, you know, you only shoot to save somebody else. You never shoot in self-protection, because you just don't know what your motives are. So I don't know what self-forgiveness is about. So somebody sometime want to do some research and write me a paper, I'd appreciate it. Offer opportunities for service to others and ways to make a positive contribution. Accompany veterans in finding decency and goodness in working for others. And model self-forgiveness and repair of harm process of making amends. Encourage discussion of current relationships, because what's going to happen is people have problems with their current relationships, and if they have no way to talk about them and no place to talk about them, they can bring back all kinds of bad memories. And form deeper connections, develop strategies for greater openness and sharing, and personal coping strategies for inevitable stress and conflict, and reflection on broken relationships that can repair in some form. I think it's what they like to see for themselves. I think that's very important. And who will continue to matter to them, and how can they make support arrangements with those people, and what values and beliefs and communities will continue to sustain them as they move forward. One of the things that spiritual recovery really looks at is lamentations for lament and for losses. And, you know, I don't know how many of you read the Psalms, but there's a whole section of the Psalter hymnal that it sounds of lament. And they're all the same. And the Jews knew how to pray. You know, they grab God by the ear and say, come on down here. I got something to do with you. These people are after me, and I represent you, so you got a stake in this stuff, bud. I don't hear too many Christian Reformed people praying like that, but maybe we should. But I think that whole business about laments, they go through that whole process, and as they're talking, they remember that they're talking to a God who was a God who they had been talking to once before, and the memory of what God has done in the past. And in all of those Psalms, you'll see themes that come with God's faithfulness, His trust, and His love. Those things always come back because in memory of what God has done to us, we remember that. And then transformation and renewal, and then reconstruct moral core values and self-worth. So there's the laments, complaint against God, realization of the conversation is with God, and remembering of divine love and faithfulness, and then restoring one's soul to God. Support people for loss, I think, to make amends, and a lot of these people get involved in those kind of activities. Forgiveness and discipleship. And I think discipleship is very important because, the command was go and make disciples and not the command to go and baptize. You know, anybody can baptize, but to go and make disciples means you're making some kind of commitment to a person. And absolution, letting go and moving on. And that absolution is a very, very difficult thing. In the early church, in the first 3 centuries, when they say the church was more pacifistic, I don't think it was pacifistic as much as it was not wanting to participate in idolatry. Someone who was converted to Christianity would have to go through the rites of penance for 9 months before they would be allowed at the Eucharistic table. When I first read that, I said, holy smoke, 9 months of being a penitent for what? Well, if I'd been raised in an army and schooled in an army where Caesar was Lord, it takes time to unlearn Caesar is Lord and to acknowledge that Christ is Lord. And so that's why they went through such a long period of penance. And now penance is almost something that doesn't take place in churches anymore, and neither does absolution. We just changed ministers in the church that my wife and I go to, and in one of the first Sundays that we had an interim pastor, after the service of confession, he said, and I proclaim to you in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ that your sins are forgiven. And I hadn't heard that in 10 years. And I started to cry. Because that was the most relieving thing that I had heard. All the rest of the people were silent, even though they had a chance to tell me, because of who you are and who you believe in, you're okay. And the liturgical year has a great rhythm about it. You go through Lent, and you're dealing with suffering. You go through preparation for Christmas and everything, and you're dealing with all of that stuff of being prepared. I heard a minister once in the time of expectation preaching about being blessed by not being able to conceive children. Because he and his wife were sterile, and they couldn't. And that was a real lament for them until they found adoption. And in adoption, they really felt that they had really been gifted. And so all of those rhythms are helpful. And then there's a constant repetition in religious circles, various reliving of baptismal rebirth and sacramental structure to life, and finally, a dramatic reenactment of sacred stories of redemption here and now. That's from Walter Brueggemann, and You know, do you ever think about how strange it is, those of you who are Christians who saying, Christ the Lord is risen today? 2015? No, he was risen a long time ago. But in order to celebrate it, we say today. And I think a lot of religions try to reenact that kind of event in their own life so that it becomes real. And I think I said something about all of that. There's some recommended resources, and those of you who picked up the brochure from Bright Divinity School, they're on the back, or you can go to Bright Divinity School's webpage, and now they have an annotated bibliography. But some of the ones that are really powerful are Soul Repair was written by my friend Brock and Gabriel Tini. So I worked with Japanese American and Italian American, and I was Dutch American. So that's really a cooked soup. But they wanted me to be co-author, but instead I said, no, I think it would be better if I told my story, because it'd be better that a 40-year-old, that a 50, 60-year-old man who had 40 years in the military can say he has problems with PTSD, that maybe that's a better modeling than writing a book. This On Killing by David Grossman is also a very good one. There's the one I mentioned, Shaded Black. Carl Malantes is a good book. And here's the one, Until Tuesday. Yellow Birds is a novel. And then Achilles in Vietnam is by Jonathan Shea. And The Untold War by Nancy Sherman. And Nancy has just completed another book. And I have it, but I haven't opened it yet. So. And there's some other resources. On the Hauenstein Center, you have the what we did last year, and you'll be able to get the lectures from this conference on the Hauenstein Center in a couple of days. And there's a good one on Conscience in War, and then Bright Soul Repair. And there's some films that are very good. Soldiers of Conscience is a great one. The Invisible War is really one about sexual harassment in the military. And so that, I think there's so much stuff coming out being written by soldiers of this war, and for that I'm very thankful, because the soldiers of Vietnam did not talk about the war. And that was to our detriment, and I think it was a loss to America. And these young people are talking about it, and I think they should be praised for that. Anybody have any questions? Well, good. They give me the job of closing out, and I can't thank the committee enough that worked on this. Last year, 4 of us did it, and this year we had about 8 or 9 of us doing it, and it really spread the work a lot. Elena is probably the most organized lady I know. She could fold my socks anytime. And to all of you for coming. It's a long day, but I think these are very important subjects. And the thing that's important is it's not going to go away today or tomorrow. I mean, guys who were in World War II that I interviewed for the Library of Congress didn't start talking about their problems until 40 years after they were discharged. And so 40 years from now, you'll be hearing stories untold about Afghanistan and Iraq. And if you don't have your ears open, then you're going to face the same thing we face today, when 22 veterans a day commit suicide. 22 vets a day commit suicide. And 2 years ago in the United States military, we had 243 suicides of those who were on active duty. We lost more to suicide than we lost on the battlefield. And I hope that you'll think about that a lot and really think about our young men and women who are fighting these wars. Yes, sir.
Are women vets also committing suicide? Women veterans, are they also committing suicide?
Women veterans, there haven't been a whole lot to study who've been in combat, but the ones who have been, like in nurses stuff and graves registration, they're suffering a lot of PTSD and moral injury. The moral injury that the women face is because of the sexual harassment and sexual misconduct that's portrayed upon them. And, you know, if you think about that, it's rape in the military is like incest in a family. Because you're so close to everybody that everybody is family. You know, we call it the band of brothers. Now it's a band of brothers and sisters. And so rape is very traumatic in the military for women. And yet the vast majority of rapes that happen in the military are rapes that are conducted on men. But we're going to have a lot more study on women as they increase and as they get in some of the real hard disciplines. So thank you all for coming. Go in peace.